Hi guys, my name is Maria. I'm an illustrator and character designer from Turin, Italy. You may have taken one of my courses for 21 Draw before, and in that case you probably know me already. But if you haven't, here's a little bit about me. I have been working as a freelance artist in the animation and publishing sectors for the past 4 years, and I've had the opportunity of working with some of my favorite companies like Disney, Hachette, and Sweet Candy. As a freelance artist, I take on several different types of projects, like books for children and school books, and sometimes animation, for which I do character design or storyboards. All of these projects are different, but they all have in common having a very unique style, which is decided by the art director or by me if I am the art director in that specific process. So style is a very common word nowadays. It's a word that gets bandied a lot on social media, where there's, a lot of draw this in your style challenges and stuff like that. But what is style? I mean, one of the questions that I get asked the most by people on social media is, how did I find my own style? And it follows, how can someone at the start of their artistic journey find theirs? I think that style isn't something that is set in stone. Style is always evolving, mostly because artists are people and people are always changing. But of course there is a difference between trying to find your own style with a series of conscious choices and exercises and simply sort of stumbling around trying to make sense of what you're drawing. Looking back at my own journey, it took me quite a while to figure out what was my style and to develop a way of drawing that was cohesive enough to be recognized as a style. And even now, if I look at other people's art, like people that I follow on Instagram or ArtStation, I look at these amazing artists and I see that they have a very cohesive style and beautifully consistent sort of like feeds. But then I look at mine and I see that every single drawing looks a little bit different, and that's bugged me for a while actually. But ultimately I reached the conclusion that only experimenting and constantly changing our style, we can actually improve and grow out of our comfort zone. So in this course, I want to tackle what is stylization and sort of break it down into stages to understand how you can take a character from the very realistic to hyper cartoony. What are the steps that you need to take to do that? Along the way, we'll talk about shapes, proportions, coloring techniques, and strategies that you can use to explore and find your own style. I'll be using a Wacom Cintiq 22 HD, which is my tablet, and Photoshop as my software of choice. Actually, there are 2 videos in this course that focus specifically as an overview for Photoshop, so if you've never used it, here's your tutorial. Of course, you are also very welcome to use any other digital drawing software or any tablets, even pencil and paper really, for the first half of the course at least. The course is divided into theoretical sort of classes where we talk about style and sort of break it down into manageable steps, and then practical videos where I do demos with you to show you practically how you can do that with Photoshop. At the end of each class, I'm going to give you some homework, which you can do to practice on your own, and which you can also send me if you want me to have a look at it. I'm also going to give you some references and bibliography if you want to take up the challenge and do some further readings on your own, since the subject is so huge. If at the end of the course you have done some art that you want to show me, again, don't forget to tag me on social media. I am MLM_illustration, and I'd love to have a look at it and give you a shout out. I guess there's nothing else to say. If you're ready, let's get started. Hi guys, and welcome to the first section in this course. In this video, I'm going to focus primarily on the theory behind stylization to give you a general understanding of what is style and an overview of famous styles from past and current artists. I'm going to try and keep these theory sessions as concise as possible, as I'm sure you all want to get sketching. But I promise you, it's vital to understand the foundation of these concepts in order to then progress much more swiftly in the practice part. Think of these introductory videos as the literal foundations of your draftsmanship. You can cut corners and jump to the part where you start copying other people's style, slowly stumbling upon your own. However, it will actually be much quicker in the long run to spend a little time on studying what makes a style recognizable and plan ahead the strategy to build your own. It will still take some trial and error as art isn't an exact science, but it will still be more efficient. So let's get going and analyze what is stylization. The first artifacts and paintings created by humans date back to the Paleolithic era, in a period that spans from 40,000 to 4,000 years ago. The most famous example of these are the cave paintings found in the Lascaux caves in France, which are estimated to be 20,000 years old. As you can see, this is already a kind of stylization, since the animals and the vegetation are not realistic. They aren't photographically accurate, I would say. They are a representation of what these humans saw and the way that they interpreted it. Historians think that these kind of paintings were made to explain rules and rituals of these civilizations, so they had an educational scope primarily, to pass on knowledge since they didn't have writing at the time. If we move forward, in a time frame of 4,000 to 400 years before Christ, we have what is usually called ancient art. This broad term puts together all the art created by advanced ancient civilizations like Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and the art of the Americas. Most ancient art is characterized by a certain level of rigidity, up until the invention of contrapposto by Greek sculptors. Again, the scope of this type of art was mostly educational, or to record important historical events. The Code of Hammurabi is the best example for this, as it is literally a bas-relief bearing inscription of Hammurabi's code of law. In this perspective, I think it makes sense that the characters would be quite static and that the author wouldn't want to immortalize particularly dynamic scenes, as the tone of the piece would be quite solemn and serious. If we compare two ancient statues belonging to different time periods and cultures, we can see how there is already a vastly different stylization going on. The first statue dates back to 2490 BC, and it is believed to depict the king Menkaura and his queen, although historians aren't 100% sure. The statue is believed to be funerary, as the characters are wearing ritual formal clothing, and they were placed striding out of a memorial building as if walking towards the afterlife. We can see how their pose is very rigid, shoulders contracted and fists clenched. The legs are straight, even the one that is moving forward. Again, it makes sense to me that the rigidity would be emphasized in this case, as the purpose of the statue was very solemn. Let's have a look at the Doryphoros, one of the most famous and most copied statues from ancient Greek. This particular copy is a marble rendition of the original bronze, created around 450 BC, so about 2,000 years later than the Egyptian one. The statue may look very naturalistic, almost completely realistic, especially in comparison to the one we've just seen. However, nothing is 100% realistic, unless it's literally a cast from a human body. The thing is, the Greeks at this point were obsessed by the mathematical ratios of the human body and were convinced that they could find a perfectly harmonious canon, so they strived to create statues that would be as realistic and natural looking as possible. That is in itself a conscious approach to stylization. Earlier on, I mentioned the concept of contrapposto, and this is the perfect example for it. The author wanted the Doryphoros to look like he was striding by, just going about his business, so they positioned him in contrapposto, that is, with legs and arms in opposite tension. Right leg and left arm going forward, left leg and right arm a bit behind, with the pelvis and the shoulder line creating a syncopated X figure between them. Bear in mind that it is likely that he was holding a spear in his left hand, so it would be even more balanced. The Doryphoros was found in a gym in Pompeii, so it would make sense for him to be naked and to embody the perfect proportion of a man, even though no normal human could even be that proportioned in the first place. We'll get back to this idea of scope and meaning, so hang on to it. The following period looks kinda drab in my opinion, especially after the naturalism preferred by the Greeks. Medieval art, that is the art produced in the Middle Ages between 500 and 1400, is basically religious art. The Middle Ages were a period of cultural and economic depression, where the population of Europe was severely depleted and the Roman Empire collapsed, leaving only small cities and many smaller villages and castles to fend for themselves. The only people that were educated, and indeed that probably had time to do art, were monks and artists commissioned by the church. So almost all of the art related to the church. It was mostly decoration for chapels and miniatures in books, so of course a very didactic use. As you can see, we have gone back to very rigid positions, one-dimensional figures and more abstract decoration and ornamentation as opposed to the realism the Greeks like so much. If you look at this Madonna by Simone Martini or this painting by Duccio di Buoninsegna, you can see how the body of the figures portrayed is completely obscured by the amount of clothing on top, which makes them even shapeless. The important thing was to convey the aura of sanctity belonging to these holy figures, although whether they managed or not is up to subjective taste. From an objective standpoint, it makes sense that a religion that preached the mortification of the flesh wouldn't be so hot on naked bodies. From the perspective of religious people at the time, the body was to be ignored and hidden away for being sinful. This in turn led artists not to look for a natural portrayal of scenes, but instead to continue the one-dimensional depiction of reality, with the characters looking quite flat over the backdrop without any attempt at three-dimensional perspective. After the medieval art, we have the Renaissance, probably one of my favorite art moments of all art history. As often happens in history, after one period that is especially close-minded and restrictive, there is one of cultural openness. This is the Renaissance, which takes its name by the Italian word Rinascimento, which literally means to be born again, of course, after the metaphorical death of the Middle Ages. A lot of art produced in this period was still religious or around church themes, mostly because artists needed to have a patron not to starve, and the church had a lot of money. However, there are many examples of non-religious patrons, as a middle class of merchants was becoming richer and was able to commission portraits and decorative paintings. Renaissance painters like Michelangelo, Raffaello, and Leonardo da Vinci hugely relied on the Greek ideal of artistic canon, looking to imitate nature at its core, being as realistic and natural-looking as possible. Again, this was done, I think, in part as a reaction to the very stylized art of the Middle Ages, and partly because of the philosophical ideas of the time. After a period of religious oppression, artists and thinkers were looking at science, theorizing humanism, the idea of putting the person at the center of the universe and moving away from God. It is not a coincidence that linear perspective became popular at this time, as it added realism to the scene. In the last part of the Renaissance, what is called sometimes mannerism, artists started already to move away from the perfect and harmonious proportions so loved by the ancient Greeks, and towards greater stylization. Artists like Vasari started creating pieces that featured smaller heads and more elongated limbs and exaggerated details, which reflected their perception and interpretation of the world and stressed the style of the actual subject of the painting. Between the 1600 and 1750, Baroque happened, and people just upped their drama vibes to 11. Artists in this period, like Caravaggio and Rembrandt, loved to use lighting to tell stories. Everything was about the action narrated in the painting in a complex game of looks, lines, and light. In a way, this artistic period was less about the stylization of the human body, which is what we talk about most in the course, and more about the style of rendering the color in the scene. However, as you learn in the next videos, color render is an integral part of stylization, so it's still relevant. An interesting evolution of Baroque was Rococo, which followed it for most of the 17th century and was characterized by lightness and elegance. Art was mostly a means to decorating and ornamenting things like porcelains and furniture. In this portrait by Gainsborough, we can see how there is a definite stylization of the human figure as well, making the shapes rounded and elongated, oval-like, to accentuate their grace, and the use of mostly pastel colors to really put some distance with the intensity of Baroque. In a way, this kind of color palettes really reminds me of the chill-out aesthetic of some current manga and anime styles. Of course, the human body stylization is different, but the vibe is very similar. Between 1750 and 1850, there was a revived interest in history as archaeology became a full-fledged discipline, and discoveries in Athens and Naples brought artists to go back to the naturalistic and harmonious proportions of the Greeks in a movement called neoclassicism. So again, like during the Renaissance, we can see an attempt to depict the human figure in a proportioned but idealized way, like in this portrait of Napoleon by Jacques-Louis David. Another movement contemporary to neoclassicism was Romanticism, which stemmed from a larger school of thought that encompassed philosophy, writing, and music. Romanticism was in a way the dark twin to neoclassicism, where the latter embraced reason and proportion and illuminist values. Romanticism delighted in passion and emotivity. Romantic painters preferred to paint en plein air, and despite showing artistic similarities to neoclassicism, presented a more explicit stylization of the human figure, mixing up proportions for the sake of their own imagination, rather than to try and represent reality. As it's evident from Fuseli and Blake's work, the themes of the subconscious, the dream, and the human mind in general were predominant, which seem to have inspired them to change the body proportions to fit these darker tones. Started in the 1840s, realism was a movement that developed during the advent of photography and journalism, committed to only depicting what was possible to see with your own eyes in real life. For obvious reasons, this movement isn't of much interest for this discussion, so let's quickly move on to Art Nouveau, which is arguably one of my favorite artistic movements of all time and a big influence on my own style. Art Nouveau, perhaps as an opposite reaction to realism, as so many of these movements are, made a point of stylizing the human figure, decor, and everything really. In a way, it started the idea of illustration as we know it today. Art Nouveau influenced a varied range of media, from architecture to graphic design to jewelry making, and was centered around the idea of the flowing lines and nature, depicting sinuous shapes and natural elements. Especially if you look at the human figures depicted by Alphonse Mucha, you can see that they didn't simply try to reproduce the human body, but they do so in a consistent style. His emphasis on mixing realistic elements, like for example the rendering of the face and the close draping, and some obviously flat ones, like the hair most notably, it's all packaged by thick outlines that make his style unmistakable. The use of elaborate frames and other decorative elements around these characters is equally recognizable. It was as if Art Nouveau freed artists from the constraints of traditional visual art. And that, plus the start of a period of accelerated social change, brought artistic movements to change far more rapidly than before, giving birth to very abstract schools like the Impressionism, and later on all the avant-garde movements of the 1900s like Fauvism, Expressionism, Cubism, Surrealism, we got all the isms, and then we have optical art, pop art, minimalism, and most recently, contemporary art. And this is just speaking of what is widely considered museum art. The 1900s saw the rise of comic books and animated features too, which is the realm that probably interests most of us right now with regards to stylization. It's still important to observe and note that all these historical art movements that I've talked about in this video already employed stylization, even though a different type, perhaps less exaggerated than the stylization we are used to today when watching animated movies or playing video games. If we go back to the idea of scope that I mentioned at the start of this overview, we can gather that stylization is closely linked to the aim and target of your art. When art was a tool of the church during the Middle Ages, there was no interest in depicting the body in detail, since the body was something that was considered sinful and distasteful. When Romantic artists sought to portray the depth of human psychology, their stylization turned a little morbid and grotesque. When art was a tool to decorate all aspects of reality in a society changed by the Industrial Revolution, Art Nouveau painters looked to harmonious shapes to bring nature into the city. So if anything, a takeaway from this video is that when you want to develop your own style, you have to always consider what will you be drawing and who will you be drawing it for. Together with this course, you'll find an ebook and a series of assignments to help you along in this journey. For this video's coursework, look for Assignment Video 2. I've compiled some of the most fundamental works of art for each art movement. Have a look at them and think about what makes them recognizable and what makes their art style recognizable. Is it the way that they put heads out of proportion? Is it a specific type of rendering, outline, or the way that they are flat or 3D? Write down all the features that are shared by each work of art in each movement. I'll see you in the next video when you're ready. Hi guys, and welcome back. In this episode, we are going to approach the features, the variables, if you like, that are most often altered when drawing the human figure and that can make a character look realistic or cartoony. I'm going to pull up some examples of popular character designs so that we can see together how these variables can be tweaked to achieve different purposes. Some of the examples are taken off the web, while others are taken from art books that I have bought or that have been given to me as a present. And now I have quite a few. I've put together their titles in the bibliography if you want to check them out. As a side note, I believe that art books are a wonderful way to learn more about animation and the animation pre-production and process that goes into an animated movie. I know they are quite pricey, but perhaps you can make it known among your friends and family that you'd like to receive them as presents for whatever holidays you celebrate. So that is a good way to get your hands on a few of them. There is absolutely nothing wrong with looking stuff up online, but it's also nice to have the physical thing to read, and this way you're also supporting the work of the studios that have made these movies. Without further ado, let's get started. I have broken down the features of stylization into 4 main steps. First, the human figure varies widely according to its proportions. Proportions are the relationships or ratios between height, width, and depth of an object or a person. Proportions are recurring mathematical patterns both in nature and in human-made artifacts. Perhaps you have already seen or tried the method for the 1 head into 8. This is a popular, simple way to draw bodies that are considered realistic. However, the ratio between the head and the rest of the body is but one of the many ratios that we can adopt to observe different types of stylization. You could also look at the size of the torso in relation to the length of the legs, for example, or the length of the whole upper body in relation to the lower body. All these relations make up the full body proportions of the character you are drawing. If we take a character like Captain America, who belongs to the Marvel universe and leans towards the more realistic style, and we compare to a blank silhouette of an actual male body taken from a body scan, we'll soon notice the differences in general proportions. As I mentioned, the silhouette I've put in this canvas for comparison belongs to an anatomical scan of a fit male body. I'm gonna try and put these characters on the same scale by matching roughly the size of their head. Of course, this won't be 100% accurate, but it'll give us a pretty good idea of the difference in ratio. The main difference between a real body and a Marvel superhero is the width of the figure and the number of times that the head fits in the body. As you can see, Captain America has a rather small head compared to that of the anatomical scan. Or you could say he has a very large body for the size of his head. Same difference. The proportions between torso and legs are similar to that of a real-life person. It's just that he is just way bigger than a normal person would be. If we take a female character belonging to a video game universe that, again, still leans towards the more realistic proportions, like Diva from Overwatch, we can appreciate how much she actually deviates from a real-life body. The biggest difference is the ratio between the legs and the torso, where her legs are significantly longer than they would be, and the torso much smaller and shorter. Her head is also bigger than it should be, according to the general size of her body. Her feet look quite big. Actually, they look almost the correct size for a human of her height. But in comparison to the slimness of her body, they seem bigger. To make matters more interesting and diverse, let's take a character from a Disney-style background, like Elsa from Frozen. As you can see, the ratio highlighted when talking about Diva is magnified with this design. The torso is much smaller and shorter in comparison to the legs, and the face much bigger. Her arms are also quite short, and her frame or build is generally very slight. If we take a couple more characters from TV cartoon shows or cartoon strips and shorts, like Finn the Human from Adventure Time and Betty Boop, we can see that the change in proportion is immediately noticeable. In this case, I couldn't keep the similar head size ratio compared to a human because they would have come out incredibly small. So I've tried to scale them to the other characters as if they were in the same sort of universe and they could actually, talk to each other. So both with Finn and with Betty, their head is several times bigger than a human head would be compared to the rest of the body. In terms of the body proportions, Finn's torso is actually weirdly accurate in terms of ratio to the legs to the real-life human size. It doesn't look like it because the lack of detail in the figure makes it a lot less recognizable and farther away from a real human. But in terms of pure length, it actually is very accurate. Betty's torso to legs ratio instead seems to be closer to that of Elsa's, with the torso much shorter than the legs, which is in general a rule that is maintained for most female-presenting cartoon characters across media. As a general observation, we could say that stylization happens on a range, rather than being divided into specific categories. Every character design ever created is positioned on this imaginary line that goes from a real-life human to a stickman. The more the ratio between the legs, torso, and head varies, the more the character moves down the range, closer to the stickman. The more it keeps in the same ballpark as a real-life body, the more it gets judged realistic. We can definitely say that the more cartoony characters have bigger heads, as we notice with Finn and Betty Boop. After analyzing the primary proportions of a character, we can proceed to the second step in breaking down stylization, that is the secondary features exaggeration. By secondary feature, I mean things that are contained inside the general outline or silhouette of the body, like nose, eyes, mouth, muscles, ears, fingers and toes, etc. By exaggeration, I mean the tendency in stylized drawing to enhance or diminish the prominence of a certain trait for comical effect or to make the character more memorable. The closer these features are to the real-life dimension and prominence, the more the character will come across as realistic, and vice versa. Let's start from the last addition to our list, Betty Boop. Betty's eyes are much bigger than a real-life human's would be. But that's the only characteristic that is exaggerated. All her other facial and body features are actually downplayed. Her nose and mouth are small and round. Her ears basically non-existent if it wasn't for the hoop rings attached to them. Her hair is also sleek and adherent to her head. Hands, fingers, and feet are tiny, effectively making her design essentially a big head with huge eyes. Finn the Human's secondary features are all pretty much smaller or less prominent than they would be in real life. His eyes are two simple dots, his mouth is a line. He only has 4 fingers and his feet don't show any level of detail. He doesn't even have a nose, the poor lad. Design-wise, the creators of Adventure Time did something called spaghetti limbs, as in the character's legs and arms don't really have any normal junctions at the knees and elbows, but they are like rubber tubes, bending in an arc at all directions. This is a fun feature to give a character, especially from the point of view of animation. Elsa's secondary features follow the general Disney style insofar she has pretty big eyes compared to the rest of her face, while her nose and mouth are probably slightly smaller than they would be in real life. Interestingly, her hair is also exaggerated. This is a common Disney feature, especially applied to female characters. Disney character designers have a tendency to make the back of the character's head slightly padded so that their hair looks more voluminous and of a more definite shape than human hair would look like normally. This enhances the character's appeal both in female and male bodies, as hair is considered a fashionable and attractive feature to have in our society. Her femininity is also highlighted by an extremely slim waist, which is actually smaller than her head. Although, as it's typical for many Disney heroines, the size of her breasts is downplayed and minimized. In my opinion, this is done to emphasize her youth and also to avoid making the character too sexy and mature for the eyes of children, who are the main target of the princess movies. Unlike Elsa, Diva is quite well endowed in this regard, breasts being an emphasized secondary feature of her design. While she doesn't display as big a bust as some manga designs can do, in comparison to Diva's general slimness, her breasts are still definitely oversized. Her facial features are closer to real-life proportions than Elsa's, with eyes only a little bigger than normal and nose and mouth only a little smaller. Her hair, instead, follows the Disney rule and is quite big compared to her head. The thinness of her waist in comparison to the enlarged size of her hips creates a common feminine trope of the hourglass figure. Last but not least, the one exaggerated feature that is immediately noticeable in Captain America's design is the amount of muscle he sports. His facial features are very close to those of a normal human, aside from the size of the square jaw, which is exaggerated. But most of all, the sheer width of his body and the amount of muscle is what sets him apart from other characters. His hands, feet, and fingers are also quite big and blockish, further conveying a sense of power and stability. Now, the third aspect of stylization is the type of stroke employed in the design render. To better explain this feature, I'm gonna quickly take Elsa's character design and show you what I mean. Here I have redrawn Elsa based on this concept taken from the Frozen art book. In the first image, I have simply traced her face as it was drawn by Disney's concept artists. But in the next one, I have adopted a different kind of stroke type, which makes Elsa recognizable, but also unmistakably different. The type of stroke used to draw Elsa normally is a soft stroke. Of course, there are parts of the design that are pointy or squarish or spiky, but the stroke itself is soft, gentle, following round paths as much as possible. When I drew her again, I looked for the areas where the stroke could be broken. For example, where two elements join, or at one point in a curve where I could insert an angle and add a corner. This process left all of Elsa's features exactly the same, but also looking very different, which has a big impact on the final style of the piece. This is particularly noticeable when looking at 3D models. The Clash of Clans characters are a perfect example of hard strokes. As you can see, they create a very materic bevel to highlight the shape of each element in the character. Here in the hair, or even on the fingers, where they should be a round cylinder, they insert a slight corner to make them look more like a very round 3D rectangle. If you compare this 3D render to a Disney 3D model like Rapunzel, you'll immediately notice the difference. Rapunzel has a very soft stroke, following around and smoothing each 3D shape, while the Clash of Clans characters remain blockish. The last variable to take into account in breaking down stylization is that of color and texture render. These two aspects are obviously interlocked, but aren't exactly the same thing. Let's try and shed some light on what these two concepts are first. By color render, I mean the technique of coloring employed by the artist. For instance, one could use block or flat coloring, which means laying a single shade of a specific color, say blue, on a certain surface and leave it at that. This is of course not what happens in the real world, where colors are much more mixed as a result of light and the way the human eye perceives the reflectiveness of different materials. Flat colors don't care for complexity. They just show you one hue for a certain element, and that's it. The opposite happens when one tries to use a more painterly color technique, which puts together several different shades of the same hue to convey a more complex idea of the color of a certain element. Flat color characters can also have information regarding their 3D shapes conveyed by the use of lighting and shading, but it's usually cell shading, that is a type of well-defined shadow and light area that is again quite blockish. Flat and painterly or even hyper-realistic styles are at the end of a range, with many examples in between. On the other side, we have texture, which is basically the information given by the artist on the type of material that we are seeing, its roughness, its reflectiveness, its porosity, etc. These textures can look realistic and therefore add realism to a piece, or they can be just decorative, adding depth and noise to an illustration. Again, both options are completely valid and serve to achieve different styles and scopes. I had drawn a chart to show this concept with the type of coloring on the horizontal axis and the presence or absence of texture on the vertical one. I have pulled some examples from the internet. So we have one of my favorite TV shows, Avatar: The Last Airbender. Avatar style is flat and cel-shaded, without any texturing whatsoever. This is a common style for animated TV series, which usually work on a tight deadline and with relatively small budgets. On the other hand, my favorite animation studio's Cartoon Saloon has a very recognizable style, which has become something of a trend in the past few years. They use rather flat colors, but add on them a lot of fantasy texturing, used in a way that isn't necessarily realistic, but that adds to the depth of the image. So I'm gonna position them in the top right-hand quadrant. A famous artist and YouTuber, Ross Draws, has a very specific painterly style that looks super smooth and sleek. I would position him in the bottom left quadrant, towards the painterly style, but without any texturing. Marco Grassi, an Italian artist, is known for his hyper-realistic portraits. He is definitely at the very end of the painterly range. However, he doesn't overindulge in texturing, only as much as it's realistic. So I've placed him halfway through the texturing range. Finally, something like the style used in Hair Love, a beautiful animated short I encourage you to watch if you haven't, is similar to Cartoon Saloon's aesthetic with a lot of texturing, but also is a lot more painterly than that, especially when it comes to the backgrounds. As you can see, the two aspects of rendering can vary hugely and offer a completely different style with many different pairings. For this lesson's homework, I recommend that you use the attached chart and go find some more references to dissect following these 4 parameters, so that you can put them on a range from realistic to cartoony and try your hand at this analysis. This type of chart, among others, is also a great tool to define your own style, so we'll get back to it again in future videos. See you in the next video when you're ready. Hi guys, and welcome back. In this video, I'm gonna give you a quick tour of Photoshop, since this is the software that I'll be using to show you all the stylization demos in the course. Of course, the general rules that I'm teaching could be applied to any digital drawing software or even to pencil and paper. So if you prefer using Studio Clip or Procreate or Fresco or Sketchbook Pro or whatever other software out there, there really are too many to count and to be proficient in, go ahead. I personally think that Photoshop is still the best industry standard for freelancers who need to have a wide range of tools in one package. I know, for example, that Studio Clip is a favorite among manga artists and comic book artists because it provides some tools specific for layouting and creating perspective grids, and it even offers pre-made reference characters for a number of poses. I've never really used it though, for more than a couple of times, because I find it a bit counterintuitive after years of using Adobe products. Also, as far as I know, Studio Clip doesn't have a whole other range of options for photo editing and animation that I like to use in Photoshop. I love using Procreate, but it does have its limits because it runs on a tablet, which has a limited RAM and processing power. So you can have huge canvases in Procreate, or rather you can, but you have to give up the amount of layers that you can create. and my workflow includes creating a ton of layers, so it's a trade that I'm not usually willing to make. This is to say that each software has its pros and cons, but for my everyday studio work, I prefer using Photoshop on my Cintiq because it gives me ample screen size and it has a very solid software with a wide range of tools, which goes well with the fact that as a freelancer, I'm often asked to work on many different things. For personal art and downtime drawing, I prefer Procreate on my iPad because I can snuggle up on the sofa or in bed and it feels more like a hobby. Also, it's happened in the past that I had to work while traveling, and of course in that case the iPad is an absolute lifesaver as you can still do most things you do on a desk computer on a tablet. So let's see how Photoshop works in detail. By the way, I'm using Photoshop on a Mac, so while the tools and windows will be the same, it's possible that some of the layout might be different, as well as the shortcuts that I mentioned. A shortcut using the Command tab will usually translate to Control on a PC, but you can find comparative lists of shortcuts very easily on the internet by Googling Photoshop shortcuts Mac PC or something like that. So for starters, the great thing about Photoshop is that it's part of the Adobe family, and they all share the same interface principles. So when you learn how to use one product, it will take you a very short time to use another. Generally speaking, Adobe products have the toolbar on the left-hand side, the windows like layers, color picking, history, etc. on the right-hand side, and the options related to each tool on the top bar. If you want to use Photoshop as an animation software, the timeline will appear at the bottom. But that is an advanced workspace, so I'll stick with the basic workspace for this course. Workspaces are a collection of tools and windows preset in specific layouts that Photoshop offers you as you open the application for the first time. You can find them here in the top right corner. As you can see, I use a workspace called Maria, which I have custom made for myself because it's the layout that I find most comfortable. When you open Photoshop for the first time, you'll probably find it set to Essential, which has a smaller canvas area and 2 columns of windows on the right-hand side. The rightmost window shows you the libraries, which are a useful tool developed by Adobe in recent years, which allows you to save palettes and graphics or templates from one Adobe software to the other and import them directly into your document. I don't use the graphics much, but I find it very useful for the color palette management. Simply put, Adobe has a great online tool called Adobe Color that allows you to build color palettes based on complementary, triadic, and other color theory concepts, and to save them, if you're logged in with your Adobe account, on the website. When you go on Photoshop, if you are logged in with the same account and you have a working connection, you'll find these palettes already in your library windows, ready to be used. The really awesome part is that you can also go on the Explore tab on the website and look up palettes made by other users, which is particularly helpful if you're stuck for inspiration or you're tight on a deadline. Next to the Libraries panel, we have the Color windows. That allows you to pick colors and view them in different ways, like color swatches or on the color wheel. Personally, I think you need to only keep the color pick one open at the beginning. Underneath, you have properties and adjustments. The properties relate to the information of the layer that you have selected in the layer panel and how they appear on the canvas. You can change its position by inserting different values, mirror it, flip it, rotate it, or align it to the edges of the document itself. I don't think this is particularly useful if you use Photoshop just to draw, so I mostly keep it closed. Same goes for the adjustment panels, which allows you to quickly create an adjustment layer on top of a layer that you are currently on. An adjustment layer is a layer that changes the appearance of all the layers underneath it. So for example, if you add a black and white adjustment, it will affect all of the layers underneath it, and you don't have to go and change each one of them by one. However, I don't think having a panel for them is particularly useful, since you can do the same thing by using this button at the bottom of the layer list. Below, you can finally see the layer panel, which is one of the most important when using Photoshop as an illustrator or concept artist. As you can see, you have a column of layers and groups of layers, which you can easily rename by double-clicking on their title. I recommend keeping your layers tidy and name them with self-explanatory titles like line art or background or character X, Y, Y, Z. Because otherwise, when you have 20 layers, you'll start wasting a lot of time turning them on and off to figure out what is on each layer. At the top of the layer panel, you have information on the properties of each layer. As you can see on this drop-down menu where there is written normal, you can choose the blending setting of each layer. That is, the way that the layer blends with those underneath and how it can change their appearance too. When it's on normal, the layer appears as a solid object. If you change it to multiply, each color in that layer will multiply the colors underneath. If you move it to difference, for example, the colors of the layer underneath will be inverted according to the colors of the blending layer. The blending layer being the layer that you are modifying. The various blending modes are grouped by type, with the darken blending modes on top. These modes obviously darken the layers underneath in their own way. While the darken mode, for example, simply makes the image look darker because it analyzes which layer has the darkest pixel and selects that one, a mode like multiply multiplies the luminosity of the lower layer using the blend color, which generates a darker but also more saturated color. This is a very popular setting and used by many digital artists to make shadows. Underneath, there is the lighten blending group, which affects the brightness of the base layer and is in effect the complementary aspect to the darken modes. Still below, there is the contrast group, which is a mix of darken and lighten blending settings. The modes in this category can behave in two ways. If the colors in the blend layer are darker than 50% gray, a darkening mode is applied. If they are lighter, a lighten mode is applied. The result with these effects is almost always a color that is more saturated than the original. Then we have the inversion blending mode category, which looks for the variation between the base layer and the blend layer. This means that the resulting color will often be a subtraction of the base color and the blend color. Below, there is the component category, which uses the different combinations of the primary color components, hue, saturation, and brightness, to create the blend. For example, the hue setting preserves the luminosity and saturation of the base layer and adopts the hue color of the blend layer. The saturation setting preserves the luminosity and hue of the base layer and adopts the saturation of the blend layer. Conversely, the color mode preserves the luminosity of the base layer and adopts the hue and saturation of the blend layer. Luminosity, of course, does the opposite thing. When you select a group that has several layers inside, all with different blending modes, you'll see that the group registers as pass-through, which means that the individual layers' blending modes affect each other in their appointed order and the layers underneath according to their original mode. If you change the group's blending setting to something else, Photoshop will first apply all the effects within the group and then apply the group as a whole to the layers outside of the group and below it. If you change it to normal, the layers in the group will still affect each other, but will not affect the layers underneath below, which is a neat trick to remember when you have several characters in the scene. In the layer panels, there's a few more buttons that make sense to look into. First, you can see the checkered icon box. This is to pixel lock your layer, and it's a great tool to remember. To pixel lock means that if you draw a line on an empty layer and then pixel lock it, you can then change your brush color and color anywhere on the page, but it won't leave a trace, because the layer is locked apart from where there are already pixels. So this in effect means that you can recolor your existing pixels, areas colored, etc. without worrying about being too precise or going outside of the line art. Next to it, you have the layer opacity bar that goes from 0 to 100, where 0 is completely invisible and 100 is completely visible. At the very bottom of the layer panel, you'll see various icons. The effects button will let you apply certain effects to each layer. So, for example, you can add a stroke or a drop shadow to a whole layer without having to draw it by hand. I don't find that particularly useful in illustration, but it's a fair substitute to hand-drawn effects, especially if applied to graphics or text. To the right, you have a rectangle with a circle in the middle. This icon creates a mask on the layer that you have selected. This is actually one of the best tools in Photoshop, in my opinion. The mask allows you to keep the layer as it is without having to erase stuff that you might need later, but hiding it for the time being. I'll explain it. The way we see things in Photoshop and other digital drawing softwares is divided in different color channels, which are RGB, red, green, and blue. There is a fourth channel called alpha, which tells the software how visible or how transparent something is, and therefore whether it needs to show what is on the layer underneath or not. The alpha channel works on a scale of white to black, where white is completely visible and black is completely transparent. When you create a mask on top of an existing layer, the mask is all white, meaning that everything on that layer is visible. If I select the mask icon next to the layer in question and color in black on the canvas, you'll see that the image starts disappearing. That image isn't getting erased, Photoshop is simply reading it as invisible. As I said, this is a great way to erase part of an image you don't want, but you're not sure whether you'll need again. Because if you need it again later on, you don't have to redraw it, you simply have to go on the mask and color with white, and it will make reappear the parts that you had deleted before. Next to the mask tool, there is a black and white circle that allows you to create adjustment layers, as we already talked about. Next to it, there is a folder symbol that allows you to create a group where you can place layers, and still next to it, there is a plus symbol which allows you to create new layers. The last icon, the trash can, allows you to delete layers. In the Essential workspace, there is yet another column of panels where you can find the History panel. This tool shows you the past actions that you have made on the canvas and allows you to go back with Command-Z or Control-Z for PCs. Keeping all these actions on memory takes up quite a lot of RAM, so if your machine is struggling, I recommend lowering the number of recorded actions. This will mean that you'll have a limited number of Command-Zs at your disposal, but will also improve performance. You can change this and many other performance variables by clicking on Photoshop, Preferences, and then selecting the appropriate tab, in this case, Performance. As you can see, I have 50 backed up actions in my Photoshop. You can also tell Photoshop how much memory it can take up to avoid computer freezes. I set this to 70% of my overall available RAM, so that Photoshop is still pretty fast because it can use a lot of my memory, but if I get an email, for example, just the action of downloading that email won't freeze up the whole computer because I don't have any available RAM left. This is a quick overview of the Essentials workspace in Photoshop. I know it can feel overwhelming, especially considering that I've just unloaded onto you information that could easily fill an entire course. Trust me, you don't have to understand or remember everything at the start. Photoshop is like a big mansion, and when you're new to it, you can stick to figuring out where is the kitchen and the bathroom. The rest will come with time and practice, as you explore more and more the software on your own. If Photoshop becomes your digital drawing software of choice, there will be a day where you'll know it like the back of your hand, and it won't be that far. In the next video, I'm gonna show you the custom workspace I've created for myself and why I think it's a good workspace to use as a digital artist. See you there. Hi guys, and welcome back. In the last video, I talked about the basic settings of the Essentials workspace in Photoshop. There is nothing wrong with using that workspace if you're new to the app. However, as you become more experienced, it's likely that you'll want to develop your own custom workspace that suits your workflow best. In this video, I'm going to show you how I arrange my custom workspace and how you can create your own. The way that you can switch between workspaces is by clicking on the window icon in the top right corner of the interface. Here, you'll see various presets like 3D, motion, painting, etc. At the top, you'll also see any custom presets that you have saved. In my case, here there is one called Maria. The first big difference is that I only have 2 columns of windows on the right side, of which one I mostly keep collapsed so I can use as much canvas space as possible. I feel like this is the best choice for artists, as you want to have as much visibility and movement area as possible. As I mentioned before, I think that the only really vital tabs to keep open are the color management and the layer list. By having only these 2, there is the added benefit that you have a ton of space for the layer list, which fills up pretty quick, believe me. In the collapse column, I keep all the additional tabs I occasionally need to check, like the history, properties, the text-related tabs like character and paragraph, the libraries, and the brush list. The brush window is probably one of my most used, and it deserves a little in-depth analysis. Brushes are a difficult topic to approach, I think. A lot of beginners, myself included, think, and I thought, that brushes make a good artwork. This is mostly untrue. A digital drawing can be improved by a nice brush, but it has to be fundamentally good. A fancy brush will not and cannot save a weak drawing. This is an important distinction because I get asked about what brushes I use a lot, and while I have no problem showing people my brushes, I feel like as a beginner you should limit yourself to 2 or 3 brushes max. So you can learn the basics without worrying about what is essentially a nice plus. When you open Photoshop for the first time, you only have a few brushes included as a preset. These are grouped in the General Brushes group. You can easily find a ton of free brushes online on the Adobe website. This is the Kyle Webster Mega Pack, which includes brushes of all types for sketching, inking, painting, special effects, you name it, there is it. To import them, you simply have to download them, drag them in the brush preset folder in your Finder, if you have a Mac, and restart Photoshop. Either that, or you can click on the icon in the top right corner in the brush tab and select Import. Now that you have a million brushes, however, you'll spend ages trying to work out which brushes you actually like. Hence my advice to start with just a few. I have created a folder by clicking the folder icon at the bottom of the tab and called it Favorites. So whenever I find a new brush that I like, I simply click and drag it from the groups to that one. I also try and give these brushes names that I will recognize immediately. You can export these groups by again clicking on the icon in the top right corner and then select Export Selected Brushes. This way you can back them up somewhere else in case you have to reinstall Photoshop. As you'll see during the practice videos, I pretty much always use Kyle Webster's Animator Pencil to sketch and Shiyun Kim ink brushes to do the clean line art. For base colors, my brush of choice is Loish Texture Brush and this one called Frustle Edges, which is a variation I created upon the texture brush. Another big difference from my workspace to the basic one is that I have taken the navigator window off the column and dragged it off screen. Since I use a graphic tablet to draw, this is technically my second screen, while my iMac is my first screen. So the graphic tablet I use is a Wacom 22 HD, which is a great tool in many respects, but the color management isn't great. This means that what I see from my tablet screen is often more desaturated than how it would appear on another screen. iMacs, on the other hand, are pretty great at color management. So I have taken the Navigator tab, which shows you the entirety of the canvas, and dragged it on my iMac screen. This allows me to quickly assess how the color changes from one screen to the other, and also whether the shapes and composition of the piece I'm working on make sense even seen as a thumbnail or as a smaller image. Now that we have seen all the tabs on the right-hand side of the screen, let's move to the left side. Here there are some pretty basic and useful tools and some that I have probably never used. I'm gonna give you an overview of the tools that are actually vital for a concept artist. First, we have the various selection and move tools, which are pretty important. The first tool is the Move tool. Shortcut on a Mac is V. This allows you to move your layer around. The second tool is the Fixed Selection tool. So it allows you to draw preset rectangular or circular selections and move them around. Shortcut is M. Then we have the Lasso tool. Shortcut is L. The basic one is freehand, so it allows you to draw freehand selections as long as you don't raise your pen or mouse from the canvas. The polygonal lasso tool instead lets you set points for a straight selection. I'd avoid the magnetic lasso tool because it's wildly inaccurate. The lasso tool is super useful, especially in the early stages of sketching, and you'll see me using it many times in the practice sessions. Underneath, there is another automatic selection tool that is the Magic Wand or Quick Selection tool. Shortcut is W. This is somewhat useful, especially if you're working in color, as it automatically selects all the pixels of a specific color. It's pretty good when you have very defined block colors, but it doesn't work well with shades. When you have an active selection on the canvas, if you then select the Move tool or simply use the shortcut V, you'll be able to move only the pixels belonging to that selection around. You can also decide to transform or distort the selection by clicking on Edit, Transform, and then choosing the type of transformation you prefer. Either that or use the shortcut Command T to free transform the selection. If you want to scale the selection, later versions of Photoshop will automatically keep the original ratio, scaling at the same rate both horizontally and vertically. If you want to scale it only in height or width, you need to keep Shift pressed down as you scale up and down. To deselect, you can either right-click with the mouse and press Deselect, or use the shortcut Command D. If you want, you can fill the selection with a color by right-clicking and selecting Fill. This will open a pop-up window that will ask you how you want to fill the selection, whether with the background color, the foreground color, content-aware method, etc. The background and foreground color are the two little swatches that you can see at the bottom of the tool column. The one on top is the foreground color, and the one at the back is the background color. If you want, you can use the shortcut Command Delete to fill with the background color, or the shortcut Option Delete for the foreground color. Underneath, there is the Crop tool, which allows you to resize the canvas freehand or keeping certain brushes that you can decide in the top bar. Then there is the eyedropper, which is a very useful tool as it allows you to select a color from something you already have on the canvas. You can use this tool with the shortcut I. Then there is the brush tool. I know a lot of artists and graphic designers work with the pen tool as well as the brush tool, especially for a clean cut sort of magazine illustration style. I personally think that for concept artists and 2D artists, the brush tool is plenty, so I never really use the pen tool. The brush tool can be selected with the shortcut B and has a few options that is worth seeing in depth. If you look in the top bar, you'll see that the first you have is the shape of the brush that you have selected. And if you click on the drop-down menu, it will let you change its size or choose a different brush. This can be done also by right-clicking anywhere on the canvas while in brush mode. Then you have a bar saying Mode. This allows you to toggle the blending setting of the brush in a very similar way from the way that you can change the blending settings in the layers. If you prefer to draw and paint everything on the same layer, you'll want to use this option to color in shadows and light spots. However, I prefer to leave this alone and use the layer blending settings instead. Then you have the opacity of the brush, and next to it there is a little icon. The icon lets Photoshop know that you want to manage the opacity of the brush by using the pressure of the pen stylus. So I prefer to keep the opacity at 100%, and then click the opacity pressure in so that my brush strokes will reflect the pressure I put on the canvas, like in real life. Next to it, there is the flow, which manages how much ink you're letting through on the canvas. Then there is smoothing, which lets Photoshop automatically fix the steadiness of your strokes. If you keep this value too high, you'll get a stroke line that does not reflect the gesture that you were trying to draw at all. Plus, you'll never really learn how to properly ink with a steady hand. However, I find that a 5% is a nice value to keep selected, just a little extra help to steady your flow. Finally, the last two icons. The one that looks like a target lets the pen stylus manage the size of the brush so that the more you press down, the bigger the stroke. I always keep this selected as, again, it adds to the realism of the sketch. The last icon toggles the symmetry tool. This is a neat trick if you are creating a character in front position or if you are drawing a symmetrical scene, as it will replicate on both sides of the canvas a mirrored image of what you're drawing. Moving on, a similarly important tool is the eraser, shortcut E. This tool works exactly the same way as the brush, and you can even select different brushes to erase. Finally, you have the text tool, which allows you to create text tabs. And as you can see, there are other tools as well, but I don't think they are as relevant for a concept artist or to the artist, so I'll leave them be for now. There is only one more vital thing to talk about, and that's the very top bar where you have written Photoshop, File, Edit, Image, and so forth. We have already seen that under the Photoshop menu there is the Preference tab, where you can amend your shortcuts and performance. Next to it, in the File drop-down menu, you'll see everything related to opening existing files, creating new files, and export options. In terms of export, I think that JPEG and PNGs are the best extensions. PNG is best if you want to retain a large amount of information and don't mind if the file is quite heavy. To post your art online or keep it digital, you can easily use JPEG, which will result in smaller files with more compression and loss of detail. But it doesn't really matter because most social media platforms will further compress your files anyway, so you kind of have to get used to the fact that certain things will get lost. Next to it, there is the Image drop-down menu, where you can check quite a few important things, especially the mode of the image and the canvas size. If you're creating artwork for screens, then you should remain in RGB color mode. If you need to print your artwork, then you should change it to CMYK color mode. CMYK files will look immediately more desaturated and bland. This is because they are processed using the 4 color cartridges used by most printers. Many colors that you use on screen would not look as bright when printed anyway, because screens are lit from behind, while paper is less reflective. So CMYK gives you a better approximation of how your image will actually look when it's printed. Underneath you have adjustments, which will change certain things about the layers selected, like saturation and hue. You can achieve the same thing by creating adjustment layers in the Layer tab, and I actually recommend it because adjustment layers can be calibrated on the go, while adjustment changes via this menu are one-off changes. Underneath you can see the image size and canvas size. Now, these are different things. Image size will change the actual dimensions of the image in terms of physical size, in pixels or centimeters or inches, and depth. While canvas changes will only affect the ratio of the canvas, like using the crop tool. I always recommend to keep the DPI at least at 300 so that when you print your artwork, it won't look pixelated. Going towards the right, you'll find the Filter drop-down menu. Here you can find all sorts of filters. Again, like having too many brushes, playing around with filters at the beginning can be quite distracting. I recommend avoiding them, aside from the box blur filter, and leaving them for when you're a little better acquainted with the software. The last important tab in this overview is the Window menu. Here you can recall certain tabs and windows to appear in the interface, so that you can make your preferred layout. When you have all your tabs out in the way that suits you, you can simply click on Workspace, New Workspace, and save it as a preset that will appear on top of the Photoshop native workspaces. If you make temporary changes to your custom workspace, you can go back to the way you saved it by clicking on Reset Workspace, or save it by clicking New Workspace and call it in the same way. Photoshop will tell you that a workspace with the same name already exists, and if you want to overwrite it, click Yes and you'll have updated your workspace. And That's it. Again, I know it can feel like a lot right now, but trust me, before long, you'll start using shortcuts without even realizing it. It's just a matter of putting a little bit of practice in. Now that we have seen how Photoshop is organized, I'm gonna move on to the practice videos and show you how you can actually approach designing characters with different levels and types of stylization. See you in the next video when you're ready. Hi guys, and welcome to the first video in the practice series. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can change a character's primary proportions, starting from a realistic figure and moving towards the more cartoony range by affecting the proportions of the head to the rest of the body, the torso to the legs, the upper body to the lower body, etc. As you can see here, I have a female silhouette and a male body scan. The reason why I'm keeping the silhouette in grey is because at the beginning of the character design process, it's better to focus on the general figure and not get bogged down in detail that appears inside the figure. These silhouettes aren't particularly well defined either, as I color them in quickly using a mid-size brush and the lasso tool. This is also not a problem, since most character design work is super rough at the start. The final product that you see people posting on social media is usually a nicely packaged version of the rough sketch that they started with, so don't worry if you're messy at this stage. The best way to start is to keep loose. I'm gonna start by creating some rulers, which I usually draw in red to keep track of the relative measurements of the characters. I'm going to track the feet position and the height, as well as the crotch, the start of the neck, and the knees and the waist, which is the smallest part of the torso, while the hips are the largest point where the torso meets the buttocks. The way that I am drawing straight lines is by touching the tablet with the point of the stylus, then pressing down the Shift tab and tracing the line. This will make Photoshop trace a line as if you were using a ruler. I'm going to make a copy of the female silhouette, and I'm going to move it towards the right. To move a layer snapped to the same height as the original position, you simply have to move it while pressing down on Shift. I'm going to quickly select the whole body without the head with the lasso tool and scale it down to make the head bigger and more exaggerated. Then, to enhance this, I'm going to select the head and make it still bigger. In two very quick moves, we have already drastically changed the proportions of this body. As we said in the previous videos, in cartoony proportions, usually the legs become longer and the torso and waist smaller and more narrow. As I was mentioning before, the reason why it's best to work with blank silhouettes at first is that details can be distracting. Often we can fall in love with a specific body feature, like eyes or mouth or hair, and that can distract us from the most important question: does this character work overall? So there is plenty of time to worry about the individual details further down the line. Don't worry. So now that we have created the first character iteration, I'm going to repeat the process, duplicate the second figure and move it to the right, taking it to a new level of stylization. I'm going to exaggerate the features even more: bigger head, smaller torso, longer legs. Now the character has a very short torso and very long legs. I'm also going to scale her down a little bit to make sure that her head is roughly the same size as the others. The result is that the character now looks slightly more teen, a little younger. So I'm going to move on to a new iteration. Again, duplicating the layer and pushing the head to body ratio even further, making the head even bigger and exaggerating the characteristically female features too, like bigger hips, more shapely lower body, etc. This sort of stylization reminds me of someone like Mrs. Parr from The Incredibles. Definitely a much more stylized body shape, very clear shape language that communicates immediately that this is a woman. I think that we can actually fit a new iteration between 2 and 3, a figure that reads similar to the Disney princess characters, but not as young as number 3. So I'm doing this by enlarging the head and shortening the torso, but keeping the hips and breasts more pronounced to imply maturity. I'm quickly going to write down the figure numbers so that we don't get confused. I think that we can fit a couple more. So far, I've progressed towards the same type of stylization, that is, enlarging the head, shortening the torso, and pushing the female attributes. However, that is by no means the only type of stylization available. I'm going to show you a different way of starting from figure 2, which I'm going to duplicate and move to the right. The head is still going to be bigger, as big as number 4, but this time I'm going to shorten the legs, lengthen the torso, and exaggerate the slenderness of its shape. I'm also going to make the lower body more powerful looking, enlarging the legs and feet, as well as making the hands slightly bigger. This is a very different type of stylization from the delicate sort of Disney princess style I was working on before. This stylization reminds me a little bit of the big sister in Lilo and Stitch, and would be even more so if I took the figure a little further. So this time I'm going to shorten the torso and make the lower body even bigger, but also with longer legs. So at this point we have a sort of mix between the Disney princess and the powerful lower legs and longer torso. That is, we have a short torso with a small waist, but also with long, powerful legs and feet that are more exaggerated. So the changes between 3 and 4 are really slight, but they produce a big difference in terms of silhouette. I'm going to use the crop tool to make the canvas longer so that I can add on one more example. I'm going to take the stylization all the way down to cartoony range this time by making the head as big as the rest of the body and shortening and compressing the bust and lower body. This sort of stylization is similar to chibi style, which refers to cute characters where the body is the same size as the head. So as you can see here, in a few minutes we created several different body types at different points in the realistic to cartoony range, and with different features. In the journey to discover your own style, that is the style that you feel most comfortable with and that reflects your view of reality, it's still a great exercise to experiment in this way and see which level of stylization fits you best. Even when you get to a point where you're happy with your style, it's still useful to get out of your comfort zone and practice with this exercise. Perhaps taking an existing character and switching up their proportions, or taking your own original characters and redrawing them with different primary proportions like I have done now. Just use the lasso tool and resize them as many times as you want. As homework for this video, please take the files assignment video 6 and resize the male silhouette in the same type of exercise you have just seen me go through. Of course, you can also take the female silhouette and do it again with different proportions than the one that I have just done. In the next video, I'm going to demo for you how you can affect a character by changing their secondary features, so I'll see you there when you're ready. Hi guys, and welcome back. In this video, I'm going to demo for you how vastly you can affect a character and its style by changing the secondary features, that is the size and shape of body parts like hands and feet or eyes, mouth, nose, etc. For this purpose, I'm going to grab one of the silhouettes developed in the last video, one that isn't too exaggerated, let's say number 5, and drag it into my new file. Again, the first thing I do when working with character design is to trace some basic rulers to keep track of any changes I may adopt between one iteration and the next. Remember, in this exercise, I want to keep the same ratios for figure 5, so I'm not going to change the relative length and size of the head, torso, and lower legs. Rather, I'm going to affect the shape and dimension of the individual features within these proportions. For the first example, I'm going to widen several features, starting from the head and proceeding with making the hips and thighs larger, kind of like an oval. I also like to experiment with the size of hands and feet, because they might be a very simple thing, but it changes the impression of the stylization widely. Remember that one of the tricks for creating a successful stylization is not only to exaggerate features, but also to put them in contrast. So, if every feature in a character was exaggerated, we wouldn't notice because they would be all in relative proportion to each other. For one thing to seem bigger, another has to be smaller. So in this design, I'm making the head, hips and thighs much larger and the feet, hands and wrists smaller to enhance the contrast. In general, I quite like to have larger and rounder limbs that then slim down towards tiny feet and hands. I feel like this kind of stylization makes the character look plumply round, but at the same time elegant and fast if needed. For example number 3, I want to make the features more squarish and blockish, so I'm going to add quite a lot of mass to the lower body and the feet. I'm also going to make the hands much bigger and the face larger and more square, exaggerating the jaw. In this case, the contrast is provided by the slimness of the waist in comparison to the heaviness of the lower body. For the next example, I want to try a different geometrical shape as a reference, the triangle. I'm basically going to mix 3 and 2 in terms of the body by keeping bigger thighs and legs, but tapering them down towards smaller feet. I'm also keeping the hands quite big, but more elongated, kind of like more elegant. The head, as I mentioned, is going to change towards a more triangular shape. By making the waist much smaller, I'm creating a choking point between the upper and lower body, basically making them into 2 triangles looking at each other. For the last example, I'm going to reference a vertical rectangle and trying a very different stylization by giving this lady a more athletic build. I'm going to make the hips and thighs a little smaller and erase some of the inner thighs to make her legs much narrower. I'm going to invert the trend and make the waist and torso a bit larger and the shoulders more powerful, hinting at more muscle. Muscles are also a secondary feature that can be used to change a character drastically. I'm going to add a lot of muscle to her calves, making them jut out and increasing their size to make them even bigger than the thighs. This design seems to me a lot more dynamic than the ones I did before, and it reminds me of a superheroine like Wonder Woman, for example. As you can see, I've based these designs on geometrical figures. You don't have to do this, but while experimenting, it's good to have some guidelines or references to guide your exploration. In this, it's easy and quick to use geometrical shapes as a reference, but remember that any of these features could be paired with each other in many different ways, like the head of number 2 on top of number 5's body, or number 3's massive feet with number 4's tiny waist. Now that I have 4 different designs based on the same primary proportions, I'm going to quickly add some internal details to give you an idea of how you can further affect the stylization. I'm going to quickly give the original figure a face so that we can then depart from that one and keep it as an average. I'm pasting a duplicate of the original face on top of number 2 to show you how much the new features will deviate. I'm lowering the layer's opacity and creating a new one on top, so after I can delete the original layer. To follow number 2's wider face, I'm going to enlarge her eyes and actually make them comparatively bigger than the original. Remember that I am just improvising right now, so there's no right or wrong in this process. I'm simply choosing random features and exaggerating them or downplaying them for the sake of exploration. For example, in this case, I'm keeping the mouth quite small and the eyes much bigger. Moving on to number 3, I'm going to make the nose much bigger to shake things up and downplay the mouth. I'm also going to draw the eyes quite big, but of a different shape, rounder and farther away from each other, from those of number 2. For number 4, I wanted to try and exaggerate a different part of the face, so I'm going to go with the eyebrows. I quite like the idea of giving this character bushy eyebrows with smaller eyes, because she reminds me of a chestnut because of the triangular face shape, and the eyebrows increase this feeling. Plus, the smaller eyes make the eyebrows seem even bigger by contrast, following the rule that contrast is the key to successful stylization. For the last design, number 5, I'm going to focus on the mouth, making it occupy almost all of the space in the lower third of the face. All the other features will therefore come out a little smaller to allow for the mouth to appear as the main trait on the face. So as you can see, while keeping the same exact primary body proportions, we have created 5 different characters with different levels of stylization. Some appearing more cartoony, like number 3, and some more realistic, like number 1 and 2. For homework, I would like you to choose a character shape you developed in the previous video and experiment with it like I just did, creating at least 3 different designs by changing the secondary features. When you're done, I'll see you in the next practice video where I'm going to show you how you can use a different type of stroke render, soft or hard, to further affect your designs. See you there! Hi guys, and welcome back. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can affect the character stylization by choosing to use a different kind of stroke style for the outline. I'm going to pick one of the designs I developed in the previous video, and you can do that too, choosing from your own visual development from the previous assignment, and try different kinds of stroke outline to experiment a bit. As you can see, I've selected the symmetry tool from the top bar and clicked on vertical symmetry. You can drag the vertical symmetry line to sit roughly in the center of the design, so that whatever you draw on one side will be replicated, mirrored on the other side. The symmetry will be applied to any new layer you create, so you have to turn it off in case you have elements that you don't want to be mirrored exactly, like, for example, the hair. For starters, I'm going to draw the outlines in a style that I consider my current one. It's a mix of some hard cartoony traits that include sharp angles and obvious geometrical shapes, but also with some softer, more realistic features, like the presence of some realistic anatomy. Since we are talking about the line work in this particular step of the process, I thought I'd give you guys some tips on how you can improve your cleanup work. Cleaning up, that is the stage where you take a sketch, or like in this case, a rough shape, and turn it into a clean line art, is one of those things that you can easily do badly, and it's very difficult to do well. Some of the most common issues I've seen in this case are being too tentative, so tracing many short lines on top of one another, failing to achieve a clean look, or tracing lines lacking force, or being too brash, so putting too much force on the pencil or the stylus and ending up with a stiff and rigid hand and therefore achieving force but lacking grace. I think that inking has to strike the perfect balance between force and grace. Personally, I was part of the second group, especially when I still used to work mostly in traditional. I would press the pencil on the paper so hard that sometimes it would rip. I also tried to do cleanups using a ball pen or a marker, which made my hand stiffen even more, as I was terrified of tracing a wrong stroke and ruin the whole drawing. The first thing I was told at the time was to drop the pen and start doing cleanups with a pencil, preferably a soft lead pencil, which would help me relax my hand and keep a smoother stroke. The digital equivalent of choosing a smooth pencil to start practicing line work, I think, is to pick a soft-looking ink brush, or better yet, start with the Animator pencil by Kyle Webster, the one I'm using, with a 5% smoothing selected. Also, sometimes choosing a different color from black can help. For starters, I found that blue and pink help me being looser when I am at a sketch stage. So psychologically, choosing a more relaxing color than black can help you keeping your hand and wrist loose. Technically speaking, there are many exercises that you can do to start training your hand to be precise without getting too rigid. For example, you can start tracing many lines, one next to the other, making sure you're keeping the same length and weight throughout the exercise. When you're done with straight lines, you can move to curved lines and then to squiggly lines. This is a good exercise to repeat at the start of every drawing session, as it will help you get reacquainted with the tablet and Photoshop. When you're actually approaching a cleanup like I am doing here, you should try and angle your arm and hand in a way that allows you to trace the longest line possible without actually twisting your wrist. Clean strokes come from using the whole arm for drawing, not just moving your hand. I recommend that you set your tablet vertically on a stand so that you can keep a good posture and move the entire forearm by using the elbow as the pivot point. Setting your tablet vertically is also good in terms of optical distortion, because if you lay it flat on a table, you'll be more likely to perceive the proportions wrong as you see them in perspective. This setting is also similar to the setting of an easel in real life, so it will help you not to lose touch with traditional drawing. If you can't yet draw a single long line with force without shaking, that's okay, you'll get there. In the meantime, try and break down that long line into shorter ones. For example, instead of trying to draw the whole length of the leg in one stroke, look for the natural joining points where the line will break up because of the various body elements intersecting, and try and trace several strong lines to reach that point. Also, you can let your lines run a bit longer than the point where they meet one another, and then go in and erase the excess. This way, you'll maintain force for the whole length of the stroke, instead of having it taper down towards the end. Now that I have the basic body shape for my character, I'm going to quickly add some clothes on top, which I will do on a separate layer so that I can then erase the body lines underneath. When you're drawing clothes, you have to remember that they fit on top of the character, so usually they have to be a little larger than the body silhouette. However, in my current style, I sometimes like to mix realism and cartoony stylization. So while I'm going to allow a little breathing space in the lower part of the blouse to signify that the garment is loose in that area before it gets tucked in into the trousers, I'm going to keep said trousers completely adherent to the legs to show how tight they are. I'm going for a 50s casual style, so with a 3/4 sleeve blouse, capri jeans and loafers. Something simple that I think goes with her body shape. Now that I have my basic average stroke style, I'm going to go way more soft, that is, closer to the realistic style range, as I mentioned in the theory videos. If you look at a human body, you can, as a mental exercise, make it more abstract and identify the geometrical shapes that make up the various body parts. So you can see, for example, a triangle and a circle for the head, a rectangle for the torso, etc. This is at the basis of stylization, after all. However, the real body is made up of fine details, bumps and loose skin and wrinkles and imperfections. By employing a soft stroke, we try and replicate those little bumps and details as closely as possible. While employing a hard stroke, we ignore them and prefer a straighter, more geometrical line. So as you can see here, I'm keeping the same cartoony, exaggerated and stylized primary and secondary proportions that I developed before, but I'm redoing the line work to soften those features and add more realistic details. For example, I've made the face look more realistic by adding a small dip between the chin and the jaw, implying that the cheeks are quite round and prominent. I've drawn small lines next to the nose, implying that there are smile lines on that face. The eyes, especially the lashes, have also changed, becoming finer individual strokes rather than the more stylized vectorial eyelashes I usually draw. As I move through this exercise, I'm also going to redraw the hair and clothes to soften them and bring them closer to reality. For example, drawing individual strokes for the hair instead of the stylized bell shape I had before, and fitting the clothes on top of the body to allow the physical space between the silhouette and the garments. When I'm done with one side, since I didn't have the symmetry tool on, I'm going to simply select it with the lasso tool, tap on Layer via Copy, which will duplicate the selection on a new layer. Then go to Transform Path, flip Horizontal, and then simply move the duplicate to the right so that it completes the figure on both sides. Now that I have my soft stroke example, I'm going to create a new layer on top of the average one and try and apply a strong stroke, even though the average is already quite stylized. I'll see if I can make it even more cartoony. The trick to this is to identify the underlying geometrical shapes to the various elements composing the body. So for example, I can see the lips as made up of triangles and therefore can exaggerate this abstraction by drawing them as 3 pointy triangles. The jaw and chin are all a big triangle sitting at the bottom of the rectangle, the middle section of the face. So that will also be drawn in a pointier fashion. Basically, I'm further amplifying all the shapes and lines that I had already drawn for the first line art, adding some sharp corners in some areas, like the hips, where I can see different geometrical shapes coming together. The loafers as well can become even pointier, like the fingers and the hard line of the breasts. This might seem pretty small changes, but when you put all three examples next to each other, you'll see how much they differ. Starting from the left, you can see how, still maintaining the exact same cartoony proportions, you can have an interesting mix of stylized and realistic, while if you move to the very right, you have the combination and alignment of very cartoony proportions with a very cartoony and stylized hard stroke. For this video's homework, I'd like you to follow my example and take one of the designs you developed in the previous video and try and redraw it a couple of times in the softer and harder stroke that you are capable of. If you need some inspiration, you can check out the assignment video 8 file, where I have collected a few references from Pinterest. You can use them to help you apply the soft stroke, following these models' fine details, wrinkles, nose bumps, hair, etc., to the stylized proportions. When you're done, I'll see you in the next video, where we'll start approaching the fourth aspect of stylization, color render. Hi guys, and welcome back. In this video, I'm going to introduce the concept of color render and what it entails. A render is what is commonly called the way that you choose to color and polish your drawing. So it can be a 3D render, a 2D render, a realistic render. To achieve these different types of render, which indeed make a big difference in the stylization you choose to pursue, you have two main tools: the way that you lay your colors and shading, and whether you employ textures or not. Let's start with color, and more specifically, flat color. Flat or block colors are a single one-shade color laid on a certain element of a certain character or object. I've gone ahead and flat colored the lady I developed in the previous videos to show you exactly what I mean. Don't worry, I'm gonna get back to this demo and show you exactly how I did this, but for now I just wanted to show you the final result. In this particular flat color render, I have almost only used colors to separate the various body elements, erasing most of the line work I did in the previous videos and only keeping a few lines where I wanted to show you a separation between elements that had the same color, for example around the breasts, the seams of the jeans, and for the loafers detail. This method gives the character a very clean, almost vector look. A different type of flat render would be to keep the line work as well as the flat color. I'm going to drop in a character I drew recently to show you how different it looks. This is a character design based on a fantasy series that I developed for a self-appointed challenge in December 2020. As you can see, the primary and secondary proportions are already vastly different from the lady I've developed in the previous videos. However, speaking of color render, the presence of the black line art makes a lot of difference, even though the 2D flat colors are the same method I use for the lady. Yet a different type of 2D render can be seen in this other drawing I did recently for a playing card, showing an elemental witch with ice powers. In this case, I've also kept the line art, but I have changed its color from black to a slightly darker shade than that of the element that it's bordering. This is yet another 2D flat render style that I often use and that can be often seen in comic book art. To achieve this look, you simply have to pixel lock the line art layer and then color on top of it with a darker shade than the color underneath, color picking the base color and moving to a darker hue on the color wheel. A flat color drawing can be then shaded, which means that a layer of shadows and light is applied to the block color. The shading can be cell shading or soft shading. The main difference between these two methods is that the former is done with areas that have clearly defined outlines, while the latter is usually painted with a soft brush, like an airbrush, with an opaque edge and gives a more 3D look. This version of the lady from before has been cel shaded, as you can see from the well-defined borders of light and shadow. Cel shading is the preferred method of shading for animated TV series, and it used to be for movies too, before the use of computers made other types of soft shading more manageable. Having clearly defined light and dark areas is vital if you're on a deadline or have a tight budget and need to animate a character, as you'll need to redraw and animate all those lighting and shading areas too. Soft shading, as I was saying earlier, gives an object a more 3D look, hinting gradually at the three-dimensional shape of the object or part of the body. For example, this colored circle can become a 3D sphere or a ball just by adding some shading, preferably soft shading. Don't worry if it seems like I'm moving quite fast through these concepts. I'm going to go back to the technical aspects of lighting and shading in a couple of videos' time, but for now I just wanted to introduce them to you. So the next concept I mentioned is that of texture. Texture literally means the material or grain that something is made of, and can be as little as adding some noise to a flat color to using special effect texture brushes to paint materials in concept art or realistic art. Textures don't necessarily have to be realistic though. Actually, in a lot of contemporary illustration, textures are used as a way to provide some more depth to very cartoony shapes, creating a lovely mix of stylization and fake realism. This is a style guide I made when I worked on my company's indie game demo called Out of the Hat, which has a very flat texture style, almost like a children's illustrated book. As you can see in this value study, we added a lot of natural looking textures to flat shapes to make them more realistic, that is, more similar to texture of a tree bark, while keeping the shape very cartoony. I feel like a little overview of different types of texture brushes in Photoshop is in order, so here we go. Some texture brushes have a textured edge, like one of my favorite brushes, which I got from a bunch of Lois brushes I bought on her Gumroad ages back. Some brushes instead work as texture stamps, recreating preset shapes that help painting in a very short time natural elements like leaves and grass or hair. I'm gonna show you a sample of my favorite texture brushes that I use every day, or that are at least among my favorite when I work on more painterly jobs. On the texture version of the example lady, I've used several different textures to give you guys an extended taste. I wouldn't normally use this many on a character. I usually only texture some areas of the skin, like the blush on the cheeks and redness on shoulders and elbows, and sometimes the hair, but in this case I went a little overboard on purpose. As you can see here, I'm using a lot of brushes from my favorites folder. These are all brushes coming from different packs I bought over the years and then collected in one folder. Brushes like rock, dirt, fat fun, and coverage are what I would define special effect textures, since they don't just have a textured edge, but the texture is evenly applied to the entirety of the brush, so you can pass it over a whole area and make that element look more like rock or ground or water or whatever. What I meant before when I mentioned using textures not in a realistic way is exactly what I've done to this lady's hair. I've applied a combination of dirt and rock textures, even though she clearly isn't a rock. By applying these textures in a fantasy way to an element of the character, I'm adding depth to this element and making it more interesting while keeping in the realm of the very stylized. Loish texture brush is the textured edge brush I usually use for laying down flat colors, as it has a really nice edge that makes the drawing look a bit like it was torn off a piece of paper, giving it a very handmade traditional look. Aside from the brushes I used on this lady, I have a few more in the favorite folder, namely Kale's ink brush from the Inkbox pack, a chalky brush I use on rocks and to give paper a worn-off look, a dirt coverage brush from Tonko House, a triangle brush I use for bushes and trees, and various magic and energy brushes I have recently used in the Cosmicember challenge. Now, there are literally a million texture brushes on the internet, so it will be your job to slowly sort them out and decide which ones suit you and which ones don't. I recommend that you put the ones you like in a folder as you figure them out, or you'll end up forgetting what was what. But what if you wanted to create your own special brush? Well, here's what you can do. I'm going to create a custom skin brush to show you the process. First, you have to create a new square document. I made mine 300 by 300 pixels. You can choose a different size if you want, but I wouldn't go too big as that will be the size of your brush. Then make sure that you pick the color black and a very generic brush from the General Brushes folder. If you open the Brush Settings tab, you'll see that there are several parameters that you can play with. For now, only Shape Dynamics and Transfer are checked. Shape Dynamics is what allows the brush to change its size according to the pen pressure. Since I want to make a rough skin brush to resemble the skin pores, I'm going to check scattering and turn the scatter and count values up to separate the individual dots within the brush. As you can see, if I try it on the canvas, it's already creating several dots instead of a smooth line. I want this brush to be quite filling though, so I'm going to use the brush a few more times until I get a roundish glob of dots. When I'm satisfied, I'm gonna go to Edit, Define Brush Preset, which will create a new brush out of this image that I have on the canvas. I'm gonna call it Skin Test, and I encourage you to always give self-explanatory names to brushes if you want to keep your workplace tidy. So now, if I test my brush, I can see that the various parameters like shape dynamics and scattering are turned off. So if you want, you can turn them on and tweak them in the brush settings panel. And then you can simply tap on the little plus at the bottom of the panel to save the brush with a different name. I'm going to test the brush on a skin tone swatch, so I'm going to create a layer with the test circles and then a new layer on top and make that into a clipping mask so that I don't paint outside of the circle by mistake. So as you can see here, this brush is already quite nice, building up a soft porous color over the swatch. However, I would like to also have a rougher brush for the skin blemishes. So I'm gonna save this brush with the name Smaller since I changed its size from the original one and create another. I'm gonna go back to the same basic brush as before and just put down some dots to create that blemish feel that I want. I'm gonna duplicate the layer to make the image darker and then again select Define Brush Preset to create a new brush. I'm going to play around with shape dynamics and scattering a bit so that I can control the size of the brush with the pen pressure, and I could keep it this way or create a new sample of skin and create a third brush by selecting Define Brush Preset again. So going back to the color swatches, I'm going to quickly add a few more layers and put the skin blemishes to test. By adding the blemish on Multiply and Soft Light, I'm able to quickly achieve a feeling of roughness of the pores, so I'm pretty happy with it. Of course, if I were creating this for an actual job, I'd spend a little more time on it, but as you can see, the process is super easy, so you can quickly make tons of texture brushes for any occasion. In the next video, I'm going to take you through the actual demo of laying down flat colors, and for this lesson's assignment, try and follow the brush creation process I showed you and create a few new brushes of your liking. See you in the next video when you're ready. Hi guys, and welcome back. In this video, I'm going to demo coloring a character with flat colors to achieve a clean, almost vector look. I'm using the Stylised texture brush to lay down the colors. As I might have mentioned earlier, I really like the subtle, ripped paper feeling it conveys. As I will never tire of repeating, I think that beauty in art is achieved through contrast. So this is true for the contrast between shapes, as well as the color method and its brush. This clean, vector-like 2D style is very popular nowadays for website illustrations, icons, and motion graphics, as well as for magazine illustration. It usually implies clean-cut outlines too. By switching up the clean-cut borders for rough, textured borders, you provide a contrast within the color technique, which I find very appealing. I'm going to put each element in this drawing on a different layer so that I can manage them easily if I want to change their color or tone halfway through. Another way that you can achieve the same result is by creating a solid color layer over the whole silhouette and then add each layer for the single elements on top and tie it down to the base layer through clipping masks. I usually use the latter method when I keep the line art in, but you can try both and see which one suits you best. You should keep the new elements on top of the line art layer and try and be as precise as possible going over it. I know it will take some time to reach the level of precision that will allow you to do this quickly. At first, I had to spend a lot longer on this than I do now, and often I would try and put the line art on top and then recolor it as a way of a shortcut, but it doesn't work, believe me. If you keep the line art on top and then pixel lock it and then recolor it with the same color of the elements underneath to save time, it will actually take you longer to recolor each bit very precisely so that it blends with the elements underneath seamlessly. So unfortunately, you just have to stick with this method and practice to improve your speed in this method. For the skin tone color, I usually force myself to pick a color that is a bit more saturated than what I would normally choose. This is because I personally tend to be quite conservative with palettes, but I've noticed that characters and illustrations turn out much better when you try and push your color boundaries a little. By keeping each element on a different layer, I can quickly tone down or change the color altogether at any point during the process, so I don't really need to worry about it being too bright. I place each layer in a specific order so that logically they go behind or in front according to their order in the drawing. So for example, the layer with the face will go in front of the layers with the neck. Speaking of the neck, I choose a slightly darker tone for the neck than the skin tone of the face so that the division between the two immediately stands out even without a line art. I'm being quite precise with the outline of the lower border with the blouse because this way I can put the blouse on a layer underneath the neck and will not have to be as careful, since even if I go over the outline, it will be covered by the neck and collarbone. Going back to the layer with the face, I'm finishing up the forehead, and as you see, I'm not being particularly precise with the front bangs, since those will go in the front. I'm going to jump back down to the neck layer and I'm going to put the hands and the other parts of visible skin on that layer too. Again, making sure that the border with the sleeves is neat so that I can use it as the front layer. Then I realized at this point that I could simply do this once for both sides instead of repeating the same process on the right side. So I simply selected and created a layer via copy. Then flip it and move it to the appropriate place on the right. At this point, I'm turning the mirror option on, because that is just good sense when you have a specular character. I foolishly selected vertical symmetry instead of the last used symmetry, so I have to reset it as central as possible. But if you haven't moved your character from one step to the next, you can simply tap last used symmetry and you'll save yourself some time. So after I finish coloring all the exposed skin, I usually merge the various layers to keep it tidier. I'm gonna then lower the layer opacity so that I can still see the line art under the areas where I colored over, and I'm going to create a new layer for the eyes. I would normally color in the hair at this point, but the hair is the only part of the character that isn't symmetrical, and I have just turned the symmetry on, so it makes sense to do everything else first. I'm gonna go with the teal color for the eyes, mostly because it's one of my favorite colors and goes well with auburn, which is what I wanna color the hair. I'm really picking the first colors that come to my mind during this demo, since there could be a whole other course about color theory and picking palettes, so let's just say that if you're ever in need for palette inspiration, the Adobe Color website I showed you earlier is a great place to start. I'm going to color the eyelashes on yet a different layer. This is because I want them to cover the irises, obviously, but I also still want the liberty of recoloring the pupils and putting some texture on them, so they need to stay on a separate layer. For the lower eyelashes, as you can see, I'm really trying to modulate my stroke in order to make them larger as they move towards the external part of the face, and remain light and small where they are closer to the nose. I'm gonna create a new layer underneath the iris layer for the white area of the eye, which is called sclera. I don't actually pick 100% white to color the sclera, as there are no truly white parts on any human being, so I usually go for a gray that is very close to white. Same thing applies for the teeth if they are visible. As you can see, I've pixel locked the layer with the irises so that I can color in the pupil. This can be done in many different ways. A black dot, but also a gradient with a darker shade of the iris's color getting darker towards the area where the pupil is. Recently, I've started drawing the pupils like a largish dot of a darker shade of the iris, so that's how I'm gonna do it. Then I'm moving to the layer with the lashes and coloring in the eyebrows there. For the pointy end of the eyebrows, instead of trying to paint it with a very small brush, I prefer to simply paint a little over the line and then erase the unnecessary parts. This is an effective strategy for many finer details in coloring in general. Instead of spending a lot of time trying to paint precisely, sometimes it's best to simply be a little more approximate and then erase the excess. Now I'm going to proceed to color the clothes, starting from the blouse. I'm going to create a new layer underneath the skin and pick a nice coral red. Again, this is one of my go-to colors. As you'll practice more and become more used to do drawing and coloring characters, you'll start developing a series of preset palettes, so to speak. This is partly because we all have different taste, and that taste tends to show consistently throughout our production, and partly because there are running trends in the art community, especially on social media. The teal and coral red combination is a very popular palette that has been trending for a while now, and for good reason. The two colors go well together and are very eye-catchy, while maintaining an edge of vintage and design appeal. I'm actually coloring the belt on the same layer as the blouse. Following my own reasoning, I should put it on a separate layer. Lower layer, actually, than the shirt, but in this case, it's a very small element, so I'm going to keep it on the same one. The trousers, instead, are going on the layer below the shirt, and I'm going to go with a muted dark gray to keep them unobtrusive. When coloring a large area, you can go two ways about it. Either first do the outline carefully and then get a bigger brush to quickly do the inside, or first do the inside a bit roughly and then make the brush smaller and carefully finish up the outline. On the same layer as the trousers, I'm color picking the brown from the belt and coloring the loafers. The reason why I'm using the same brown as the belt is because with this type of flat, clean-cut style, it's good to keep a limited palette. 4 or 5 colors are more than enough to whip up a compelling character, and especially as you're starting out, choosing many colors can make the whole process a lot more difficult and may produce a sort of muddled result. Now it's time to turn off the symmetry tool and focus on the hair. I'm first taking care of the front bangs that go on a layer on top of the face, to then create a new layer behind the head to color in the back of the hair. In this case, I can place the back hair layer wherever I want, because the hair isn't long enough to disappear behind the body. However, if it were longer, I would have to place it behind the blouse layer too. I usually choose a slightly darker shade for the back hair compared to the front bangs, for the same reason I chose a darker color for the neck. Also, I use the same technique as before, where I color in the full mass of the lower ends of the hair, and then go in with the eraser tool and delete the excess to create some clean interruptions in the shape. For the lips, I'm choosing a similar color to the shirt, again to keep my color palette limited. And to draw the mouth and other small detail, I usually color the central line first, and then move to the upper and lower lips. Now that I have all the flat elements colored in, I'm going to add a little bit of line art to separate those elements that are of the same color and therefore lack definition, starting from the nose. For this step, I'm picking the Amazing Cartoon brush from Kyle's Inkbox set, which is also part of the freely downloadable Mega Pack. The line art goes on its own layer, and the blending setting should be changed to overlay or soft light, so that the black color blends with the underneath layers, becoming a slightly darker and more saturated version of any color it encounters. This is the moment where I also fix little things like the hairline, which is defined by the shape of the face over the back hair. So in this case, I erase some of the face so that the back hair color can come through and fill in the small triangle in front of the ears. To draw the line art in the hair, I'm going to turn the hair layer's opacity down a bit, since I had a perfectly good outline already done and it makes sense to copy it. Of course, this time I'm not going to trace the actual outline of the head, as that is well defined and has great contrast with the white of the background on its own. Remember, I'm only going to trace the lines that help bring more definition within areas of the same color. Now, I don't like the fact that the outline is of a darker shade from the colored areas in all of the character. There are some areas where a lighter outline may be nicer, like for example in the hair in this case. So I'm gonna pixel lock the line art layer and pick a very light gray. Switch my brush to the texture brush I used before and go over the line art in the hair. Same thing goes for the seams in the jeans and the loafers details, with the difference that I'm gonna pick a yellowish tone for the shoes and a bluish one for the trousers. Now I'm going to group all the color layers and neatly rename the group Flat. Again, be tidy with your workspace. So now I have a flat color character, which could actually be finished if you like this stylization. Of course, there are many other steps that we can take to bring this coloring closer to realism, starting from cel shading, which we'll approach in the next demo video. See you there! Hi guys, and welcome back. In this video, I'm going to move on to cel shading or cartoon shading, yet another color method that can affect the stylization of your characters. Please note that this isn't a class about shading and lighting, so I'm going to move a bit fast regarding the theory behind shading and lighting, which you can thoroughly explore in my other courses, especially my class on lighting and shading here on 21 Draw, and focus more on the technical side of it. As I mentioned before, toon shading is a non-photorealistic shading method frequently used in animated movies, series, and comics to quickly give information regarding the 3D shape of a character and its lighting surroundings, or enhance the drama of a situation without spending too long on realistic or soft shading. First of all, you have to understand that all lighting and shading stems from the position of a light source in the scene. So you need to think about how the light will hit certain body parts and how the three-dimensional shapes of those parts will affect the bending of the light, creating the stronger light points where it hits full ray and shadows on the opposite side where it doesn't reach. I'm going to pull up a couple of examples from recent drawings of mine before moving on with the demo. In this doodle of a Christmas elf, the darker areas are focused on the front left area, while the light areas are on the back and on the right. This means that when I drew this image, I imagined the light coming from behind the character, angled from the right towards the left. Both lights and shadows are on two different layers, linked to the base layer with clipping masks. The shadow layer is set to multiply, while the lighting layer is on overlay, and they are both not on 100% opacity. I'm going to turn up the opacity of the shadow layer so that you can clearly see how I arrange them on the figure. To be fair, in this setting there are probably two lights. One stronger light that comes from behind, producing heavier shadows on the hunched center of the body, and one generic light, like a room light, lighting the whole figure. I can surmise this from the fact that if there was indeed only one strong light from behind, the whole of the body would be in shadow. This is fairly common though, like as most photography and visual art has a 2-point or 3-point light setting, so that the shadows and lights aren't too strong and dramatic on the character. If you take this fan art of Haso Katano I did a few weeks back, you can see that there is a generic diffuse light in the room and then a strong light point coming from the lightsabers. I'm going to turn off the various lighting layers and turn them on one at a time so that you can see the difference. The large light in the room or environment comes from the top right corner, producing shadows on objects in their lower left side and light points and reflections on the right side from top to bottom. I also have two light layers around the sabers to create a soft glow that invests the proximity around the swords. So this is all well and good, but how do you achieve these practically? Well, there are several ways to achieve the same or similar results, as always is in digital art. I'm going to sketch a quick character face to show you some basic lighting settings and what shadows they produce. In this first demo, I'm going to keep the outline in and show you the value and clipping mask method, which is different from the one I used before with the example lady. This method is very common in comic books because it's very quick to achieve compared to the vector lineless look I did before, and it's pretty good to practice different lighting settings. Also, in terms of this course, it affects the end outcome of the stylization of the character hugely, so it's good to learn and practice. This method revolves around the use of the lasso tool, so it's also good if you're still having trouble with the line work and using a stylus. First, I'm going to keep the line art on one layer and create a layer underneath. I'm going to tap L or select the lasso tool and trace all around the silhouette of the character. When I'm done, I'm going to fill in the silhouette with a block color. I then quickly fix the areas where I might have gone over the line. I filled in the silhouette with a medium gray, or around 25% gray, because for this method it's easier if you only have value, that is grayscale, instead of color. I'm going to rename this layer base value and create a new layer on top for the shadows, to then link it to the one underneath with a clipping mask. It's right-click on the mouse or pen and then clipping mask. For the first lighting setting, let's start with a light source placed diagonally behind the character on the right from our perspective, therefore hitting the character's left cheek and hair. I'm going to select a darker gray, like 50% gray, and with the lasso tool, trace the area on her face that are going to be in the shadow because of their shape or because some other element is in the way of the light. Starting from the hair, which in this case is very stylized and depicted almost as solid meshes or solid objects rather than realistic hair, I'm going to select the left-hand side of it, shading the strands as if they were long cylinders. Then I'm going to select the orbital area and the area next to the nose behind the cheeks. Of course, the area under the nose and around it is always in the shadow in some way or another, because the nose is the most extruding element of anybody's face. In this case, also the whole left area of the head is in the shade, which isn't a problem. Don't be scared to trace extensive shadows. If the character looks too dark, in the end you can add a rim light on the side that was in the shade to make sure that its border pops out again. I'm going to quickly duplicate this and create another lighting setting with the light source on the opposite side. With the light coming from the front left side, a lot more of the face is lit up and there will be less shadows overall. The shadows will be mostly on the right-hand side of the face, facing down and slanted to the right. Again, you need to consider that the nose will project the biggest shadow on the right-hand orbital area and cheek. Don't forget to also add shadows to the eyes and to shade them as if they were spheres. Most of the times, a character ends up looking flat because we forget that all these planes on the face are actually spheres. For the third case, I'm gonna pick a very dramatic light setting, which is light from below, a stereotypically horror story type of setting. With the light coming from below, you have to rethink about the various extruding bumps on the face and figure out how they will impact the elements above them. For example, there is a dip between the chin and the mouth, so there will be a pool of shadows. If you're unsure, try and get a table mirror and place it next to you on your desk. You can use your phone's torch to move the light about your face and see firsthand what type of shadows it will produce. As you can see, light from below does give a somewhat crazed expression to this character, so I wouldn't recommend using it for idyllic love stories. I'm going to choose the opposite setting for the fourth example, light from above. This setting isn't particularly flattering in my opinion, so I tend not to use it a lot, while instead I use the diagonal 3/4 light source quite a bit. The thing I like about this setting in this case is that with the wavy hairstyle, it allows me to place some shadows on the ends of the hair, where there is a dip from the extruding wave. So going back to the actual cell shading coloring method, when you're done deciding which light source settings you want to go with, you can add color in a very simple way. I'm going to pick setting number 2 and show you. So this method will allow you to keep the value study underneath in black and white and simply place another layer on top to color it by putting that layer on color blending setting. I'm going to fill the whole layer with the basic pink of her skin tone to then add gold for her hair, a slightly darker gold for her eyebrows. Remember that since this layer is in color mode, if you choose a darker color and paint with it, you're not actually going to see much difference, because the lightness or darkness of the color is given by the value layers underneath. So to make a color appear darker, you must go on the layer below and paint in a darker gray the chosen areas. Same thing goes for the lighter areas, like the sclera of the eyes. I'm coloring it in a very light gray, but it's coming out darker because the gray underneath in the value layer is darker. So what I'm gonna do is to go on the base layer and color with white on it, so that will also reflect on the ending color. To make the irises look proper blue, I'm going to paint them of a darker gray in the base layer too, as well as the headband, which I want to turn black. Now that I look at the value layer, I think that I'd like to give this doodle even more variance, so I'm going to add a light layer to the value. So I'm going to turn off the color layer for now and create a new layer between that and the shadow layer. Please note that the order of lighting and shading layers is always shading at the bottom and light on top. I'm going to add some lighting points to the hair and nose and the other areas that are more exposed to the light. This is a pretty bright light, which perhaps remains too shiny on the character's face, making it look like plastic almost. So what you can do is to tone it down by lowering the layer's opacity or pixel locking the light layer and color with a darker gray on the specific areas that you want to look less shiny. And you're done! This is one way you can achieve cell shading with a value method. A different method is the one I used on the example lady from before, where I duplicated the flat color group, created a new layer on top and clipped it to the group. Then I put that layer on multiply and chose a muted purple for the shadows. In this technique, I keep the character in color and choose colors for the shadows and lights, usually purple or blue for the shadows and light yellow or blue for the lights, trying to pair a cold shadow with a warm light or the other way around. The light source in this scene is a wide point looking down from above towards the center, so it doesn't produce very strong shadows. Rather than using the lasso tool, this time I'm going to paint the shadows directly on the body. When I'm happy with the result, I'm going to choose a light yellow and create a new overlay layer to put on top. On this layer, I'm going to paint the lighting, focusing mostly on the hair, eyes, and other obviously extruding points like the shoulders and the shoes. Both shading and lighting layers are usually toned down to about 30% opacity. So as you can see, there's always 2 or 3 ways you can achieve similar results in digital drawing. For homework, I would like you to open the Photoshop file for assignment 11 and create some value studies with the lighting sources I provided. If you want, you can do even more settings by creating your own references or looking them up on Pinterest. In the next video, we're gonna go look at some technical aspects of 3D shading or mixed shading. So see you there when you're ready. Hi guys, and welcome back. In this video, I'm going to be talking about 3D shading, soft shading, and mixed shading, which is a mix of all these different types of shading, and personally, the style I prefer. Soft shading is a style of shading that uses a soft, gradual stroke to give the object or character added depth and realism. There are several ways that you can achieve soft shading, starting from a cel shading base. I'm going to pull up the 4 examples I did in the past video and show you a few of these. Starting from the light setting number 1, light from the back and side, you can go on the layer with the shadow value and pick a soft eraser brush, keeping the opacity selected, but deselecting the pressure tool, because we want to keep this brush quite large and gradual. So carefully start brushing the eraser on the borders of the hard shaded areas until you reach a smooth, gradual feather. You can change the size of the brush when you have a smaller or more detailed area. Including the lasso tool part and then the erasing part, this method still takes a very short time. When you're done, to increase the depth and realism of the shadow, you can pixel lock the layer, tap G or select the gradient tool from the toolbar and color pick the gray of the shadow both in the foreground and background color. Then make one of the two a little darker. You can use the gradient tool by tracing a line and then letting it go from the tablet screen. This will recolor the shadow value in a way that looks darker as you move away from the light and lighter towards it. So darker gray on its left-hand side and lighter on the right in this case. Moving to the second case, I'm going to duplicate the layers and keep them to the side for reference. This is because in this method you can actively paint the soft shadows. You can do so by selecting the same brush you were using as the eraser, a soft brush with the pressure opacity on. Simply paint the shadows on the character, keeping the cel shading we did before as reference. Soft shading allows you to give a much more realistic sense of the three-dimensional shape of each element, especially the round ones like the eyes and the cheeks. So try and shade everything thinking of their original geometrical figure. This is probably the method that takes the longest to get done, although it probably also lets you be the most precise and accurate. Moving to the third example, unfortunately in this case I must have merged the shadow value layer with the base layer by mistake, so what I can do is to use the round soft brush to add to the hard outline of the cel shading in order to change it into a gradual border. Since the light from below is usually quite a harsh setting, I'm going to create a new layer, link it below with a clipping mask and select a much brighter gray to paint in a layer of lighting. As you can see, I'm keeping the brush size quite small so that I can trace a more precise, more vibrant stroke at the center and then, increasing the size a little, paint more softer strokes around it, as if the glow of the light spot was diffusing and waning. For the fourth example, I'm going to use yet a different method, which is probably the fastest of all. Select the layer with the shadow value, making sure that it's not locked or pixel locked. Then go on Filter, Blur, and tap on Box Blur. Here you'll see a dialog window that will let you decide by how many pixels you want your blur to expand. Be sure you don't choose too high a count, or the shadows will be so rarefied that they'll disappear. Something between 5 and 15 should do, so I'll go for 10 pixels. So here you have your soft shadows done in literally a click. Of course, this is also the less accurate method, but it's a pretty neat trick if you don't have much time. And if the shadows are hard to spot now, you can add the gradient to the layer like we did for example number 1. A different way to do soft shading, which I call mixed shading or 3D shading, which is pretty common in 2D renders of 3D mobile game art, is to add together both hard and soft shading, putting special emphasis on building the blocky 3D shapes of the characters. This is a style that you may have seen in games like Clash of Clans or the new Spyro franchise. I'm going to quickly put down a sketch of a character posing in 3/4 so that I have some more definite shapes to work with. For this type of stylization, you don't have to go through the line art stage. as you can just use a semi-clean sketch as guide for the coloring. None of the detail will be given by the use of line art, but rather by the employ of shading and lighting. So I'm going to quickly fill in the whole outline of the shape, then color each element on a separate layer using clipping masks. Since this is quite a soft looking style, I am not using Stylised texture brush as it is my custom, but I'm selecting a basic round brush from the general brushes folder. Really, for this style, the type of brush you use isn't really very relevant, just pick something generic and without a textured edge. When I'm done coloring the flat layers of the character with the basic hard round brush, I'm going to select the pressure opacity option on for the 3D shading. By keeping the pressure opacity on, you'll be able to modulate the shadow and lighting paint strokes, and therefore give more information regarding the depth of the 3D aspects of the shapes. I'm using a muted blue for the shadows, since I'm going to use yellow for the lights, and the rule goes that it's better to use complementary cold and warm colors for lighting and shading. The goal with this type of shading is to really define the angles of the elements with the shadows, so that you don't have to use line art. You can keep the light sketch visible as reference at the start of the process, although eventually you won't need it anymore and you can just turn it off. As you can see, I'm trying to build the 3D shapes of every element, even the hair, which I am approaching as if it were made of solid meshes rather than individual hairs. For this type of shading stylization to be successful, I think it has to be paired with rather blockish, simple shapes in terms of design, which is why I kept the nose as a rounded pyramid, the ears are big and chunky, and the hair is made of recognizable locks. When I'm done with the first round of shading, I realized that I don't like the blue I chose, as it seems too strong, so I pixel locked the layer and filled it in with a more muted brownish grey, which I prefer in this instance. Then I proceeded to create another layer and identify areas that would be in a deeper shade than the others, so that I can color them in with some more focused shadows. At this point, I can turn off the sketch layer as I don't need it as a guide any longer. The planes of the face are already pretty well defined by these two layers of shading. The trick here, as I mentioned before, is to have a deep, more defined shadow where you would normally have a line art, and then a gradual, softer shade around it as a cushion. Same thing goes for the lighting layers, which entail a harder edge light stroke right next to the darkest shadow, to then wane into a more gradual soft light. This can be done on a separate layer on top set to overlay. When I'm done with laying down the hard lighting areas, I'm going to lower the opacity to 50% and erase some of the excess. Please note that in this method, which is admittingly a bit longer than the previous ones, you have to create several layers on lower opacities to reach a balanced and harmonious result. Then I'm going to move on to soft shading using the Stylised soft shading brushes with the pressure opacity turned on and the flow at 40%. I'm doing this the same way I soft shaded the girl in the first part of this video using blue as the shade color. When I'm done, I lower the layer opacity to about 40%. The same goes for the soft lighting layer, which I paint in as a contraposition to the shadows. This layer, set to overlay, really brightens up the character and helps a lot with rendering of the irises too. At this point, it's more of a matter of how much you want to keep rendering the artwork. So you could add a lot more shading and lighting following this workflow, always creating new layers on multiply and overlay and adding in hard and soft shading to chisel the 3D features even more. In this case, I'm going to add a few more, starting with another hard shading layer to better define the orbital area, the eyebrows, mouth, and ears. I'm going to zoom in to the irises and add some detail to them too, which is really not something that I do very often, but I enjoy seeing it in this type of style. I'm going to trace short strokes departing from the pupil to mimic the flecks of darker color some people have in their eyes. Then, with a small brush, I'm going to color in a hard edge to the shapes by creating a second layer of hard lighting, and this time putting it to linear dodge. I'm going to trace these hard edges next to the very dark shadows, setting the shadows off and creating a bevel. After adding a few more touches to the soft lighting layer to better balance with the shadow, I'm finished. As you can see, all the definition in the character is given by the use of lighting and shading, and specifically by a mix of hard cartoon shading and soft shading. As an assignment for this video, I would like you to take the same PSD file you used for the last video and try and paint the same character with soft shading using the various methods I showed you, so you can test them out and judge for yourself which one suits you best. In the next video, I'm going to talk about yet a different color stylization, the painterly look. So see you there when you're ready. Hi guys, and welcome back. In this video, I'm going to approach a different type of color stylization, the painterly one. Of course, this is a very complex coloring technique which should and does have many courses devoted entirely to this topic, so this video is going to be more of an overview of the main parts rather than a step-by-step guide. I'm going to demo this style on the same example lady we used before, starting from the merged layers of the flat color. The painterly style often works only on one layer, or at least on a reduced number of layers, as it doesn't usually rely on layer blending settings to do the lighting and shading, but rather strives to paint the lights and shadows within the base layer. I have a mixed technique in this regard, painting a fair amount of tonal variance on the base layer, but also adding some layers on different blending settings for the most extreme lighting and shading effects. This said, the first thing to do is to flatten the base layer into one and setting to smoothing out the outlines I did with the Lowish texture brush, as this style requires a smoother type of edge. For most of this process, you'll see me use the hard, round, pressure size brush, one of the basic brushes in the general folder, with the pressure option deselected and the opacity option selected, so that I can build up the shades very gradually. I'm creating a new layer and clipping it to the base layer so that I can keep the base layer for backup, and I can always turn on and off the changes I've made to see how different the style looks as I proceed. Since this style is very close to realistic, I recommend that you always find some references to know how to paint skin, hair, and other different materials, both in terms of lighting and textures. In this case, I'm painting mostly from memory to show you the process, but if I were doing this for a job, I would definitely find accurate and multiple references. As you can see, this painting technique is very gradual and slow building. I am constantly moving around the face, bringing different elements up to the same level of render. The first step, as I was saying, is to paint over the textured edges of the flat color and in general create gentler brushstrokes. Every time I move to a different element, I color pick it and give a few brushstrokes. Then I change the shade of that color slightly and give a few more, creating some color variance. This is also to create lighting and shading embedded in the base layer. As for the nose, for example, I already painted a slightly darker tone in the area underneath the nose and the nostrils. If I were doing this from scratch, I would first do a quick value study of how I intend to set the light sources and keep it to the side or on a different layer. However, since I already have the cel-shaded character, I can move straight to painting the lights and shadows. When I'm done smoothing out all the contours of the character, I'm going to create a new layer to start rendering the eyes, which are actually one of my favorite parts in this color technique. I use a darker green for the pupil, but not a full black, and then also color the outside of the irises with the same dark color. This is because most eyes tend to have a darker rim on the outside, and also because the contrast with the dark edge makes the middle part between the outline and the pupil really pop. This is also why I use a much lighter and more saturated teal color to paint the middle part. In this style, the trick is not to paint everything with the same intensity and weight, but rather to use the stylus as if you were using an actual paintbrush in real life, modulating the force of your arm so that the strokes are all uneven. For the eyes light dots, I don't use full white, but again a very bright teal. In general, in this semi-realistic coloring style, nothing is full black or full white, which is why for the bottom lashes I use a medium brown with red undertones, because a lot of the human eye tends to be irradiated by blood. Then I start putting some shading in the inside of the eye and on the outside, painting the orbital cavity with a sort of darker pinkish tone. To further imply that the eyes are coming out from the orbital cavity, I paint a slim line of brighter skin tone just on top of the eyelashes, since they are catching the light. In this style, I usually go for individual lashes rather than the triangular shaped ones that I use in flat color. Still, I don't want to go 100% realistic, so I aim for a middle ground with some eyelashes showing and some being more like half drafted. There's two concepts here that are important to remember when trying painterly style. The first one is that colorist style is separated from the shape stylization. So the shapes of this character are and should be just as cartoony as they were when I colored it flat. So even if the painterly look is associated with realism, when applied to cartoony shapes, we can take some liberties to maintain the overall cartoony feeling. The other is that in this style it's important not to render everything to the same level of detail. In my opinion, this is because as a style, it can become pretty heavy and come off as stiff if everything is perfectly rendered like 100%. Instead, if some elements are very detailed and attract the eye of the viewer, like the eyes for example, then others can be almost sketched out so that they don't take away from the main focus of the painting. The skin tone is probably one of my favorite things in this style, as you can literally shape the face of your character and give a ton of information regarding the 3D layout by adding darker or brighter planes. In this case, I'm building the nose and eyes area by adding brighter strokes to the points that come out more and therefore catch the light coming from above, and darker areas where instead the face planes sink in. As you might have noticed, to add some grain to the brush strokes, I've changed the brush to coverage texture brush, which is a great one for adding a little bit of substance while also remaining very moist and painterly. When I am happy with the color tones for the skin tone, I select the smudge tool with a very soft brush and smudge away some of the grain in the skin to go back to a very smooth texture. This is mainly because I'm trying to keep the texture as smooth as possible, as I'm gonna add actual textures in the next step. For hair and eyebrows, it's important to add some stray strands of hair to give the impression that the hair isn't just one solid mass, which is exactly the opposite of what we've been doing in the other examples so far. Of course, the hairstyle needs to have an identifiable shape because the shape style is still cartoony, but in terms of the render, we want to give it a more realistic feel, hence the individual hair. Since I have the benefit of having already done several versions of this character, I'm simply gonna color pick the colors from the textured version of this lady to paint in some color variants and starting to lay the foundation for the shading. To add more individual hairs, I'm going to create a multiply and a soft light layers, painting in a lot of individual strands with a smaller brush. At this point, I'm going to switch from only painterly to layer-based and create a lighting layer on overlay to add the light reflection on the hair. Unlike my method for cel shading, this time I'm painting uneven strokes on the main waves of the hair, again to give the feeling that each stroke is different and unique, not stylized and abstract. I change the lighting layer setting to lighter color and lower the opacity to then add a new layer in multiply to create more contrast with shading. By painting the basics of shading and lighting straight into the main layer and then adding different layers to implement on them by using blending settings, I'm gonna keep rendering the figure until it's all painted. It can be quite a long process, so I'm gonna show you the final result in the next video, while I'm also going to talk about texture rendering. In the meantime, as an assignment, please take the flat color version of your sample and try to overpaint it following this method. It's okay if you find it hard, and I recommend that you download a specific course if you enjoy this method, as there are many and it's a very large topic. See you in the next video when you're ready. Hi guys! In this video I'm going to talk about texturing, both from a flat character and starting from a painterly one. So we temporarily have to take a step back and return to the flat character with cel shading. I duplicated the layers with the flat cel-shaded lady and created a layer on top, linking it to the group via clipping mask. You can texture a character with lighting and shading layers on, but for the sake of seeing the true colors, I usually temporarily disable the layers. I'm going to add textures by setting the layer blending setting to multiply and painting with texture brushes on top of each element, using a light blue that will make the colors appear darker on the pixels it touches. Since this is a flat character, I'm not trying to apply realistic textures. I'm using textures simply as a way to create more interest and depth in each element. So I'm going to start with a fabric-like texture for the jeans. It's quite normal for me to change the blending settings of the layers several times after I've laid down a texture to see if they look better in a different setting. A lot of this process is experimentation, especially when new texture brushes are involved, so I encourage you to also explore how things may look different by switching up the settings. So I've changed the jeans blending settings to soft light, and then I'm going to pick the Fat Fun brush to texture the skin in the areas that are more irrorated by blood, like the hands, cheeks, shoulders, and nose. I set that layer to multiply and then turn the opacity down a little bit. I am picking yet another fantasy texture for the blouse, specifically Loish Splatter, this time setting it to hard light and erasing the excess. Then comes the hair. So here I'm gonna use the texture as a way to also add to the shading of the hair, only applying it to some strands and not to the entirety of the hair shape. At first, I put the layer on top of the group, but then I realized that it would have been much easier to just clip it to the original back hair layer so that it doesn't spill over the other elements. So I used the rock brush to layer a medium brown color over the ends of the back hair, then change the color to a darker brown and only paint some of the vertical stripes of hair. All this while the layer remains on multiply. Same method is applied to the front hair bangs, laying a darker brown to the underbang and a lighter to the outside of the bangs. Having turned back on the general cel shading layers, I decided I wanted to add some more texture lighting too, so I created a new layer of soft light on top of the top bang layer and on top of the back hair to paint it there. For the same reason, I'm going to add two new layers to the skin layer, painting with a very large coverage texture brush to add variance to the skin tone. As you can see, the textures in this style add to the lighting and shading, as well as providing more interest for the eyes to seek out. I'm going to repeat a similar process, but starting from a different basis when I texture the painterly version of the same lady. As you can see here, I have rendered the whole figure with brushstrokes, already adding some light and shadows included in the base layer. I'm going to add some textures, partly to add to the painterly feel and partly to enhance the lighting and shading. I've grouped all the layers in the group Texture Painterly, and so, just like before, I'm gonna create a new layer and link it to the group. As you can see, I'm starting again from the jeans, but this time I'm trying to give the textures a much more subtle vibe, almost going towards realism, or at least towards a painterly version of realism. So I'm not using the texture brush in a flat way, evenly applying them to the whole element, but I'm aiming my brush strokes to follow the natural curve of the design. I've picked up this random sample brush from the Alvarez pack, and I'm using it vertically and horizontally to paint in the weave of the trousers. Then I've changed it to a different, more compressed one and picked a darker blue to emphasize the shadows in the inner thighs. By chance, I found this other sample brush that I intended to use on the blouse, but it doesn't work there, although it does work as a reinforcement to the jeans seams, so I'm using it there instead. For the blouse, I end up using this other sample brush with some kanjis as a description, because even though it's not particularly realistic for the material of the shirt, I like how it almost looks like a traditional canvas. As I said before, a lot of this is spontaneous discovery, so most of my results vary from piece to piece according to the brushes I find, even though the methodology, creating layers and clipping masks, remains the same. I'm adding a lot of layers and textures to increase the contrast between the light and dark areas, as well as giving more grain and substance to the various body parts, like the skin tone and the hair. When I'm done adding noise, I go around erasing the textured edges from the rest of the body, as I had done for the face, and I am done. As an assignment for this video, I encourage you to download Kyle's Mega Pack or some other pack of texture brushes and experiment with them, both as a way of rendering materials and as a way of shading and lighting. In the next video, I'm going to compare all these different mixes of stylization and realism and talk a little bit about how you can make them work for your own style, project by project. See you there when you're ready. Hi guys, and welcome back. It's time to draw some conclusions now that we have gone through several iterations to stylize this character in different ways. Let's start by saying that I don't think that any of these styles are better or worse than one another. They are simply different and have a time and place to be used. Linking back to the concept I introduced when I talked about the history of art, style is very much entwined with intent and target. A style that is a perfect fit for an animated series may be entirely wrong for a video game, or something for a young reader's children's book may be wrong for a feature film. Sometimes it has to do with the target, and sometimes it's even a production issue. This said, sometimes it's exactly the clash, the contrast between style and subject matter that makes a product really stand out. I'm thinking, for example, of Adventure Time, which I mentioned before. As we analyzed it before, the character design and general style for the show is apparently very simple, referring to basic shapes with very little detail and making use of a limited palette with bright and joyful colors. The animation style is similar, with a lot of exaggeration, bouncing around, rubbery limbs, and so on. But then the themes of the actual narrative are shockingly adult, which is why, as a TV show, it's been loved by both kids and adults. Finn and Jake go through what is a post-apocalyptic depiction of Earth and deal with characters that are deeply traumatized or lonely or evil, not because they are villains, but because they have been corrupted by centuries of solitude. In this case, it is exactly the mix of a heavy subject matter narrated with a playful tone and playful style that allows us to binge-watch entire seasons of Adventure Time without feeling bogged down by the depth and sometimes utter despair of the plot. So going back to our own previous exploration, we have seen how you can take many different turns at each stage of the stylization process and result into a completely different tone for the character and therefore for the project. For example, if I had chosen the primary proportions of example 8, the very cartoony one, but then paired it with a soft stroke and a 3D mix render, I would have had a very peculiar result, not unlike the design of the Netflix show Super Monsters. Yet another Netflix show, the visionary Love, Death and Robots, offers a lot of interesting style mixes, like the one developed for the episode The Witness, where we have semi-realistic proportions with some realistic render like the skin and some of the materials, but then on top of that they added random fantasy textures and flat backgrounds that almost look like a collage. I personally quite like the style of the Disney TV series, Tangled, where they paired a very stylized and geometrical proportions and stroke render with a lineless flat color and the use of textures both in a fantasy way and for shading and lighting. These are just some examples to show you how different we could have gone in our exploration, but I guess the main question remains. Now that we have broken down the process involved in creating a new style, how can you find yours? Well, of course, part of the answer is very personal and subjective, and you'll know it when you feel it. I know it sounds a bit vague, but it's a difficult feeling to put into words. It doesn't happen too frequently, but after a while that you have been experimenting with a certain style and you have felt like you were just hitting a wall like every time, you may just finish a drawing, look at it, and feel like you got it. You found what you were looking for. That idea of style that you had at the back of your mind, but you couldn't quite express. And if you feel comfortable drawing in that style and you like it when you look at it after several days, then you found it, at least for a bit. As I said, style is constantly changing, and so it's very likely that you will change your mind about your current style and get back on the journey to find a new evolution. Sometimes you have to get worse before you can get better. I have seen several artists that I followed for years having one style, then trying to change it and producing art that looked not as good as the stuff that they were making before, only to then get even better than they were. This is because when you abandon a tried and tested style for one that you don't really know or that you haven't quite discovered yet, you are exploring, and exploration can be successful or not. Also, technically, you may not be as well versed in the style that you are trying to undertake, or you may not have a great workflow yet. Looking back at my recent style journey, I can pinpoint easily the moment when I got a bit bored with my tried and tested style, which is also very popular all over Instagram and kinda similar to many other artists, which is a cartoony Disney style features mixed with a lineless and textured color render, like for example this Anna from Frozen from December 2019. And don't get me wrong, I love that style and I still like to draw things in that style, like the Azuka Tano fan art that I showed you a few videos back. But I also started feeling frustrated with it. I felt the need to improve my dynamic gesture drawing, and to do that, I envision a half-sketched look in black and white or quickly colored that maintained the freshness of the gesture pose, but was something a little more polished than a live drawing session. So I set off to see if I could find that style. In December 2019, I produced a series of black and white vignettes, which I was still completing from October 2019, showing my characters from Arcanum Academy. The girl, Rhiannon, looks shocked and the boy, Freddy, is trying to forestall her. I felt like, while it was okay, it was still pretty static for a dynamic scene, and that the line art was perhaps too polished for the effect I wanted to convey. In February 2020, I took it easy and sketched a little bit of Sailor Moon fan art in a modern setting. This Usagi I drew met my taste in terms of the complexity of the pose, but I was still working on the line art. I felt it was sketchy and fresh, but perhaps still a bit stiff and insecure. So I kept honing this style, and I got to a colored version I liked in July 2020, with this drawing of the goddess Cultivation. In this drawing, I used the animator pencil for the line art and I mixed it with a watercolor render. I instantly liked how the pose was fresh, but also how it came across as not just a sketch. Sometime over the summer, I found the Shi-Yun Kim's ink brush set and bought it on his Gumroad, immediately testing it out and including it into my workflow for this style. This character design for Siri from Workbreaker from September 2020 is the result. This drawing manages to be fresh while also being quite clean, and it took me maybe 1 hour to complete. At this point, I knew I had reached the result I set off to achieve in December 2019. The last drawing shows Rhiannon in the Inktober series I did in 2020. I purposely kept the line work very rough in this series, but I feel like it shows much more life than the drawing of the same character from the year before. I'm showing you my personal journey to give you an idea of how long it may take to develop a style you feel comfortable with. And it may not even work most of the times. In between these drawings, there have been many abandoned canvases and many roads with no exit. The great thing is that once you have found a new style, it isn't like you can never go back to previous ones. For fun or for work, any new style you conquer remains in your tool belt, ready to be taken out and employed. Maybe after you've practiced with it a little bit again. So, to answer my previous question on how you can find your own style, there are a few strategies and exercises that you can do to help you figure out what you like and what resonates with you. When I started out drawing every day and taking art as more than a hobby back in 2016, I created a folder in my computer called Art Bible. I recommend you do this as well, as it is a great way to find inspiration to improve and modify your style. I created a ton of subfolders and saved there any image I found that made me look twice. I know that you can easily do that by saving images on Instagram or ArtStation or creating a private board on Pinterest. But for me, there was something about actually saving the image off the internet and categorizing it into my computer that made it stick more. I'm not saying this to encourage you to copy straight from other people's art, not at all. But rather, I would like you to create a compendium of references that can come together and create your own unique mix of features. At the start, how are you going to learn if you don't look up artists who are farther down the road than you? When you save a new piece of art in your folder, and remember to save it with the name of the original artist too, so that you can reference them if you use it in a drawing that you then post on social media, you have to analyze it and break it down following the stylization process I showed you in this course, so that you can understand exactly what the original artist did and why it works. There's no point in simply copying features if you don't understand why they are successful, especially because they may not even work when you insert them in a style that is a little different from the original. One exercise that can help you getting used to critically analyzing other people's style is the 6 styles meme. You might have seen this art challenge before, and I'm going to take you through it in the next video. But basically, you take a character and redraw it in the exact same pose, but in 6 different popular styles. So you are forced to really analyze those styles and understand what makes them recognizable and why they work. Remember that before you can find your own unique style, you'll probably half copy other people's styles, which is really quite physiological. Over time, if you look at your own production critically, you'll be able to test out different options, changing the proportions a bit, scrambling the secondary features, trying out different color methods. Every time you test a new thing over your basic style, you'll see whether you like it or not, whether it works or not, and then finally you'll reach a new style that is an offshoot of something a little more mainstream. To help you mixing up your basic style, you can randomly assign yourself parameters in the stylization process, like an art roulette. I'll show you how. Remember the axis chart I showed you at the start of this course? Let's bring it back. This chart revolved around the color render, but we can apply similar ones to each stage of the stylization flow. This is what I call the realistic cartoony mix, and it works like this. I have created this chart comprising of all the ranges of the various steps of stylization: primary proportions, secondary features, color, and texture render. On the left, there is the realism, on the right, abstraction, and therefore increased stylization and cartoony vibe. As an exercise, you can play this game and randomly drop in some arrows on the various ranges, then try to draw the character mix that comes up. So for example, in this case, you'd end up with a character with semi-realistic proportions, medium exaggerated secondary features, a flat color render with the use of textures. This chart is also great to fill in if you're trying to figure out a style for a project, as you can drop in your references and order them on the line from the more realistic to the least realistic, and then place the arrow where you want your project style to be located. This is a page from the art bible of a project I started with my studio and never saw the light of day. I used a pre-made chart called the Hero Finder, using 2 ranges from serious to cartoony, and with abstract proportions versus human proportions. In hindsight, I would recommend you to use the more advanced version of this chart that I just gave you. What I wanted to show you in this case was just how I propped together all the references we had found and then identified the area where we wanted to place ourselves, the pink space between rhyme and sharp bound. So in the next video, I'm going to demo for you my approach to the 6 styles challenge and give you a bullet list of things to look for when you analyze a new style. See you there when you're ready. Hi guys, and welcome back. In this video, I wanted to take you through a very useful exercise to get yourself accustomed to analyzing other people's artwork and style, so that you can understand why it works and eventually look critically at your own art to make more well-informed experiments and changes. This may seem like a small thing compared to practicing and improving your drawing technique practically, but I promise you that the ability to look at your own work objectively is just as hard to master as it is to draw a clean line art, and in a way even more important. If you blindly practice the same stuff over and over but feel like you're going nowhere, it's probably because you are repeating the same mistakes. When you are able to understand the reasons behind a successful art piece or to evaluate what weaknesses you need to work on, then you will have gained the ability to improve. This said, this art challenge is aptly called Style Challenge, and you can find many examples of it on social media by looking up the homonym hashtag. You probably have seen this already on your feed actually, although I've never tried it myself, so this will be a fun video. I've taken a recent drawing of mine depicting a character from the Cosmere fantasy universe written by Brandon Sanderson, and I'm gonna start by changing it into a Studio Ghibli character. The challenge here is to depict it in the same exact pose and with the same character props, which is why I chose this artwork, specifically because I put in quite a lot of detail in the outfit. I'm going to paste in on my canvas some Studio Ghibli references along the way, taken from different Ghibli movies so that I can get a mean average of their style. Obviously, Studio Ghibli style has changed over the years because of time, and also because some of the movies are towards a slightly older audience and some towards a younger audience. So I'm picking Mononoke first because I think she is similar in age to the character I drew and also comes from a fantasy universe. The first thing to do is to get a preliminary look at the style that you're going to replicate. Write down all the things that immediately jump at you and that are typical of this style. For example, one thing I always find slightly odd about Ghibli is that female characters don't have visible lips unless they are older or particularly womanly, like seductive women characters. While they have pretty big eyes, they tend to tone down the eyelashes, so for me that will be very difficult because I love to give ridiculously eyelashes to my characters. One thing that is very typical of anime style in general because of production reasons is that the line work is very clean, without textured edges and almost weightless, as in there is no stroke weight variance between the start and the end of the stroke. Everything is even. They use flat color with cel shading with only one shadow layer and occasionally a lighting one, but tend to keep it very minimal. In terms of stroke and shape design, everything looks quite round. The objects are very 3D, as in you clearly understand the shape in space, like Mononoke's mask in this picture for example. But if you look at her necklace, which is presumably made of bone or fangs, the endpoints are still quite round even if they are supposed to be sharp. The fur attached to her mask is also completely without detail, so the objects are oversimplified, keeping their 3D shapes and are drawn with soft edges. Now that I've made this preliminary analysis, I'm gonna start by zooming in the characters so that the crop is nicely fitting in the box and lower the opacity to draw on top of the reference to make sure I'm getting the pose right. Don't worry if drawing with a different style on top of your original reference feels strange and confusing at first. We'll have time to fix your first sketch in the next step. So for now, just try and draw a very rough first draft of the character by following the new style as best as you can. So I'm trying to look at Mononoke and following the curve of her cheek and jaw, with the head being a lot more triangular or strawberry shaped than my original style, and all the facial features sort of slightly moved lower, leaving a lot of space for the forehead and hair. I'm also starting to sketch in the earrings, which will need to become rounder and slightly more simplified. In my original style, I use a sketchy sort of line art, which adds interest and complexity to the drawing, so I don't have to put particular care in depicting the 3D shapes of the props, which I actually usually draw quite flat. In Ghibli style, I'm gonna have to do the opposite, since the line work will be super tidy and clean, leaving me no way to cheat and keep some things sort of half sketched. After I have put down the foundation for the head pose and proportions, I move the drawing to the box where it's supposed to be and keep going, trying to copy both from the reference of my own character and from Mononoke. Quite quickly though, it becomes apparent that I may be getting the eye proportions wrong, which is quite common, so here's a strategy to keep the proportions from a new style in check. You can create a new layer on top of the new style's reference and quickly use the lasso tool to highlight the face area in a color, like red. Then do the same thing with a different color to highlight the individual features like the eyes, nose, and mouth. You should choose a pose that is similar to the pose you're trying to replicate, so that when you move the color structure, you can overlay it to your own sketch and compare it with minimal adjustment. By looking at the facial structure, I can now easily see which eye is bigger and whether the various features are sitting in the correct place. In this case, I got the mouth and nose right, while the right eye is too big and tilted and the left one is too small. Admittingly, the character I chose is also a little bit of a pain to replicate in terms of the eye position, because her left eye looks slightly more inward than it should. I did this on purpose because I find that a little strabismus of Venus is actually quite appealing, especially in innocent-looking characters. To work out the proportions of the rest of the head and bust, I am going to use the same color structure trick on Mononoke again, and then move the layer to the left to overlay it with my own character. If you choose a similar pose, then you don't have to adjust it much. In my case, I only need to change the tilt of the head to fit it to my character's pose, which is handy. With this indication to keep the proportions correct, I'm going to proceed with the sketch, trying to replicate the character's main features, props, and clothes as closely as possible, but still adapting them to the different style. For the hair, Ghibli tends to give their characters fringes and bangs, like there's almost no character that doesn't have a fringe actually, so even if my character doesn't, I'm going to change her hairstyle slightly to give her a few shorter locks of hair to frame her face. Another step in this process is finding additional references for specific elements if you are not sure how they are depicted from the main photo reference. As usual, there is no shame in looking for references. In this case, I am specifically looking for references for long, unbound hair, braids, and hands. Unfortunately, Ghibli doesn't really do characters with long hair, probably because that would add a layer of complexity to the animation. But at least I found references for the braids and the hands. My character's hairstyle is comprised of a series of braids in the top part of the head and then extremely long, unbound hair. In terms of braids, Ghibli tries to keep them super simple by basically representing them as sausages. As for the hands, Ghibli hands are actually quite similar to my own style, even though they are probably a little larger in proportion and with less pointy fingers, so I'm going to trace the hands I previously drew, but smoothing out the fingertips and getting rid of the nails. There is also no shame in tracing your own art to speed up your workflow, as long as it's your own art, of course. And then move them to the side to overlay in the right place to the new character. As I noticed before, Ghibli characters tend to be even more simplified than my own, with a clear depiction of the 3D shape of the items and no sharp corners. So I'm trying to smooth out the design of my clothes as well as giving them a more solid 3D build. I'm also changing the proportions of her bust slightly, as Ghibli characters tend to have longer torsos than my own style, as well as changing the dip in the top's décolleté, because, as a rule, Ghibli characters are dressed less provocatively than my character is. When I'm done with the sketch first draft, I am going to do an inverted test to see if the proportions of the head and the torso are still accurate. So I'm going to, again, fill Mononokes with color shapes and then move them on top of my sketch. I have a feeling that the head is a little small, or that the body is too big at the minute, so let's see. Having placed the color structure, I can now already clearly see that if I match the shoulders to my characters, the head in the guide becomes huge, so yes, I definitely need to scale up the head or scale down the bust. When I am satisfied with the proportions check, it's time to focus on the stroke and the line art. First, let's look at the reference line work again, and really zoom in so I check if my preliminary observations were correct. The line work is very clean, the stroke is very light, but it's not 100% weightless. If you really zoom in and look at the end of a stroke and at the start, you can see that there is a very slight variation. I'm going to look for a brush that can mimic the stroke with a non-textured edge, and I'm going to pick the hard, round pressure size, raising the flow to about 90% so it doesn't have any fuzziness on its edges. As I mentioned before, you can start by practicing a few lines on the canvas to get used to the feeling of the new brush. This line work is going to be hard for me because it's been a while since I used a different brush from the Shiyun Kim's brushes, which are super textured and therefore don't feel as rigid as this one. So as you can see, I am trying to trace steady, long lines, and if I'm not satisfied with a line, I'd rather go back with Ctrl-Z than try and fix it with more brushstrokes. This is because by fixing it, you're probably making the line work look less clean, and so it's better to simply try again until you get the precise line that you wanted. For example, it's taking me ages to do the clean line for the left eyebrow, because eyebrows are so important and they can totally change a character's expression. This said, as you move through the process, you'll probably get more accustomed to this type of line work and will be able to trace more confident lines. When cleaning up the props like the headdress, I'm actually building the 3D shape by adding bevels in perspective, and at the same time keeping those details soft by adding rounder corners. Remember when I said that to trace stronger lines, you can go a little past the end of a sketch line and then erase the excess? It's exactly what I'm doing here, drawing the line for the hair bangs. I am tracing the line, not worrying whether I'm going over the finishing point of the hair lock, and then erasing the extra bit to make sure that it's neat and tidy. Again, cleaning up the line art for the jewelry, I am taking extra care to keep the corners rounded, but also draw the bevel that gives it some 3D depth. I'm going to create another layer to clean up the arms. If you don't feel 100% confident with lines, splitting up the outline on multiple layers is a good strategy to make yourself feel more relaxed, which will also help your line work drawing skills. I'm going to draw the arms and hands, always making sure that the line stays smooth and soft, and in particular making the semi-transparent shoulder sleeves extra puffy in comparison to the original design, since that's something I've noticed Ghibli do often when they draw dresses or capes. When I'm done with the layout for the arms, I can erase the parts of the main body layer that are covered by it, and then merge the two into one with the new and amended main body layer. Then I'll do the same thing to draw the hair outline, creating a new layer so I can draw the full length of the hair to keep my brushstrokes nice and long, and then erase the areas that are covered by the main body. Since I don't have references for long and unbound hair in a Ghibli style, I'm going to have to improvise a little, keeping in mind that this style likes things to be kept as simple as possible and that I should avoid tracing too many lines within the long hair shape to keep it cleaner. When it comes to erasing the areas of the main body that are behind the long hair on the chest, instead of simply erasing and potentially losing material, you can create a mask and paint in black on it so that it looks as though you erased it, but you can get it back in the end if you change your mind. When you're done with all the line art and you're happy with it, you can merge the layers and simply call the new layer outline to keep it tidy. Now that the line work is done, I feel like we're over the most difficult step, as this style uses a flat technique with minimal cell shading, so this step shouldn't take long. The clean outline of the character looks very similar to a Ghibli movie, something in between Mononoke and Howl's Moving Castle specifically. Since I'm going to keep the black outline, in this case the fastest flat technique is to create a color mask for the full silhouette and then color in the individual elements on top of it by use of the clipping mask. To color, I am going to use the same brush I used for the inking, only changing the size according to the dimension of the element I'm coloring. In terms of color palette, of course I'm going to follow the existing one, but since there is absolutely no color variance, I'm going to choose a slightly brighter version of the colors in the original. I noticed that Ghibli movies often have very bright, happy palettes, so I'm going to make sure that the existing colors are amended slightly to get closer to their primary color shade. The most difficult thing to get right in this case is the eyes, in my opinion, since the original character doesn't have pupils or light dots in them, while the Ghibli style has both. As I noted before, the character is slightly cross-eyed on purpose, but this is magnified by the presence of light dots in the Ghibli style. Maybe a little too much. So I'm purposely leaving this for now. And this is something I encourage you to do too. Sometimes, as you draw, you'll see a detail that doesn't quite click. Instead of obsessing over it and changing it a million times, sometimes it's best to just move on to a different part of the drawing and look at it again when you're done with the production step you are taking care of. When the whole character is in color, I will have a better way of assessing whether the eyes need some retouching. When I'm done with the flat color, I'm also almost done with the whole drawing. I just need to take care of the shading and lighting, which is cell shading specifically. But as I am approaching the face, I notice that the eyes are still missing something. So I've kept the eyelashes very small on purpose, but I think they can be slightly strengthened without losing the Ghibli touch. So that's what I'm gonna do. Much better. So now I'm going to use the lasso tool and the brush tool to paint in the shading and lighting by using a multiply and overlay layer. I've noticed that Ghibli doesn't apply a shadow under the nose or the mouth, unless it's an environmental shadow caused by either the time of day or an object blocking out the sun. So the shading here is really minimal. Again, the amount and type of shading is as part of stylization as is the shape of the character. So always make sure that you have analyzed enough references in different settings so that you know you are accurately reproducing them. After fixing the opacity of the shading and lighting layers, I can pronounce the style challenge complete. It was really quite fun and an interesting learning experience. I have watched Ghibli movies so many times and I thought I knew their way of drawing inside out. But it's amazing how you can actually feel like you really know a style after you tried it on your own on one of your existing characters. So for this video's assignment, I'd like you guys to take one of your original drawings, pick a few styles you either admire or you feel like you wouldn't be quite good at it, and try this method on them. I'd love to see what you come up with, so don't forget to tag me if you post the result on social media. Hi guys, and welcome to the last video in this introduction to stylization. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. Whether you are a complete beginner or someone who has been drawing for a while but was looking to expand their horizon and develop their style further. For sure, the main takeaways when approaching stylization as a method are to try and break down a character into the 4 steps we talked about. First, work out the primary proportions, that is the relative size and length of the full body elements, the head, the upper body, the lower body. Second, focus on the secondary features, working with shapes and not worrying too much about setting the details into stone. Then figure out the type of stroke you want to give the character, whether you want to keep it more realistic with a soft stroke or more abstract with a hard one. Finally, ask yourself the type of color technique you want to employ and whether you want to use textures or not. This can be flat color, painterly colors, fantasy texturing, texture shading, self-shading, 3D shading, or realistic texturing. Or even just some combination of color, shading, and texture. The important thing when it comes to your style isn't so much whether you'll find it. I can tell you already that you won't, ever. What's important is to be looking for it, always challenging yourself to master styles that intrigue you, but that you are not good at yet. In this search, you should always keep a sketchbook, physical or digital, so that you are able to jot down drawings, but also impressions and notes to yourself. Self-reflection and critical observation of your own work will be key to be able to improve or even just to progress with some sort of direction. This way, you'll be able to identify areas that you are weaker in, like line work or color render or other aspects, and practice those things specifically. We all know what we are weaker in. It's the things that we don't like to draw, but really, those are the things that we need to work on the most. This doesn't mean to overly criticize yourself or to put yourself down, not at all. Analyzing your own work also means being kind to yourself and giving yourself some pats on the back when you like what you're seeing. Some of the exercise and practices to get out of your comfort zone can be art challenges on social media like the Style Challenge, the 6 Fan Arts Challenge, or the various Draw This in Your Style. Also, keeping an art folder on your device to pick and choose features you like from various other artists can help you develop your own unique aesthetic as well as nurture your artistic taste. Another useful strategy is to make Hero Finder style charts for your projects and to make sure you're consciously picking a style rather than being picked by it, or to play style roulette and assign yourself random characters to draw as practice. As usual, I am more than happy to look at your work if you want to direct message me or tag me on social media. And I'd love if you could leave a review on the course on the 21 Draw website, as it helps the other students as well as me. I guess that's all for now, so let me know if you enjoyed the course, and I'll see you later.